Harrenhal's darkened corridor, heart pounding like a war drum against her ribs. The stone walls, so thick they seemed immune to screams, nonetheless thrummed with the echoes of distant footsteps and murmured threats. She was only a girl, but she carried more fury in her slight frame than most grown soldiers. A small blade was hidden beneath the folds of her shirt, the edge sharpened to a wicked point she had honed night after night, imagining, praying that its first taste of blood would matter. She had made her prayers to death, for that was what she had been taught. Death was the only god she trusted these days. He was inside, seated at a long wooden table in one of the tower's many solar chambers. Lord Tywin Lannister, her secret enemy, one of the mightiest men in the Seven Kingdoms. Arya had served him wine, overheard his plans, spied upon him in her humble silence. He thought her a nobody, another piece of chattel. He would have scoffed if anyone dared whisper that she was actually Arya Stark of Winterfell, daughter to the dead Lord Eddard Stark. But she carried that identity in her heart like a burning coal. Her father's death, the ruin of her family, the savage war tearing the land apart, all of it could be laid at the feet of men like him. Perhaps not solely Tywin's doing, but Tywin was a prime mover in the Game of Thrones, a cunning manipulator whose orders had already destroyed countless lives in the Riverlands and beyond. He had let Gregor Clegane loose to sow chaos. He had played at war as though soldiers were chess pieces. He had orchestrated the downfall of the Tullus, the torment of the Riverlands, and now he commanded from Harrenhal like a spider in its web. Arya knew that in another world she might have used the secret name Jaqen Hagar had offered her, a single name spoken to the faceless man which would end her torment with no further blood on her hands. But her youth and fury demanded action of her own doing. She craved to feel the blade in her hand as a bid into the man who had so long seemed invincible. She wanted to offer death her own kill. She could scarcely sleep at night, thinking of it, seeing it in her mind's eye. It was half a moon's turn since Roose Bolton had claimed the castle for the northern cause, but Tywin had lingered longer than he should have before departing for more crucial theaters of war. Ser Amory Lorch was dispatched, commands were given. Arya caught bits and pieces, glimpses of Lannister armor passing in the flickering torchlight. She learned that Tywin intended to march north. He had lingered just long enough to glean new intelligence, to ensure that his presence alone was enough to cower the lesser lords. But in that space between hasty departure and arrogant comfort, Arya found her chance. She glided through the corridor, careful not to let her feet scuff the floor. One guard had been left on watch, but he was by the far door. Arya moved with the lightness of a cat, slipping into the solar as she had done a dozen times before, but never with such purpose in her heart. The air smelled of parchment, candle wax, and the faint musk of old rushes strewn across the floor. Her mind raced over the possibilities. She could wait, perhaps hide beneath the table or behind the large, rotted tapestry that sagged on the wall. She could fling the door open, brandishing her blade in the style of Syrio the water dancer. But caution prevailed. Tywin was a cunning man, a formidable warrior in his own right. He would not go down easily if she attacked him in the open. Arya licked her lips, calm yet trembling with adrenaline. She slipped around the table, her fingers tracing the carven lions' heads that adorned each corner. That symbol had haunted her, the lion of Lannister roaring its dominance over the realm. Now she was the wolf come to savage it. She ducked low behind the tall-backed chair where Tywin often sat. A single candle flickered on the tabletop, illuminating a map of the Riverlands. Tiny wooden tokens, a lion for Lannister men, a trout for Tully forces, a wolf for the Northern Army, were scattered across the parchment. Looking upon them, Arya felt a surge of rage. This was how they saw the world, these High Lords. Wooden tokens and lines on parchment, as if entire families could be moved about at a whim. She ground her teeth but forced herself to breathe slowly, quietly. Outside the door, she heard the click of boots. Her entire body froze. The muscles in her calves went taut, ready to spring. Then the door creaked open. Tywin Lannister, tall and severe, entered the solar with the bearing of a man who had not known fear in decades. He carried a stack of parchments under one arm, and the flickering candlelight accentuated the deep lines of age and cunning on his face. The hair at his temples was silver, and the rest of it was clipped close. His green eyes were not as bright as his children's, but they held the same cold intensity, the same blazing sense of confidence. He set the parchments on the table, sighing. "And so it falls on me yet again," he murmured, speaking to no one. "If I do not manage this war, who will?" Arya silently cursed him. He sounded almost weary, as though he carried the burdens of the realm on his shoulders. She gripped her blade and remained perfectly still. Tywin took a seat, his back against the chair's high wooden crest, hardly a foot from where she crouched. One movement and she could stab him. But she stayed her hand too soon, and he might cry out, might raise an alarm. She needed to ensure it was swift, silent, final. His eyes roved over the map. He reached for one of the wooden lions, tapping it absently. If Robb Stark thinks he can outmaneuver me, he will learn. Arya's heart raced at the sound of her brother's name. She willed herself to remain calm, to be the water dancer, to be silent as a shadow. Tywin leaned forward, setting a finger on Riverrun. We must strike swiftly. We must. He never finished the sentence. Arya sprang up from behind him, blade in hand, and slammed her palm over his mouth with every ounce of strength in her slim arm. His eyes flew wide, shock flaring there. Before he could bite, before he could twist away, she drove the blade into his neck, aiming for the gap beneath his ear. She felt the resistance of flesh, then the abrupt give as steel found a path. She had to stifle a cry herself. She had never stabbed a man like this. Tywin Lannister lurched, tried to throw her off, but Arya clung to him with feral desperation, her hand tight around the hilt, her other palm clamped across his mouth. He was far stronger. He nearly broke her hold. Blood gushed onto her fingers, warm and slick, but she twisted the blade, just as she had learned from the butcher's boy and from watching Syrio. The gurgling that emerged from Tywin's throat was ghastly. His hands clawed at hers, but already his strength was fleeing. He sank back in the chair, eyes bulging with disbelief. Arya pressed harder, tears of furious triumph threatening to spill from her eyes. She would not let this lion roar. No cry for help escaped him. He jerked once more, then his body sagged. His eyes remained open but empty. Lord Tywin Lannister, the great lion of the West, was dead. Arya fought the urge to scream, to laugh, to collapse. She could barely comprehend what she had done. She whispered, "For my father," though it came out like a hiss. She pulled the blade free, and the blood that followed spattered across the map, staining it a deep crimson. The little wooden lions lay scattered, flecked with blood. The candle flickered, casting grotesque shadows on Tywin's slack face. Her breathing was ragged, her entire body shaking. This was real. She had done it. The man who had orchestrated the War of the Five Kings in so many ways, dead by her hand, in the depths of cursed Harrenhal. Her mind snapped to practicalities. She could not remain here. The guard outside might come at any moment. She had to escape. Swiftly, she wiped her blade on Tywin's surcoat, a silent sort of vengeance. Then she crept around the table, forced herself to look away from the corpse. She took the parchments he had brought in, a random impulse, thinking that perhaps they were important. She stuffed them beneath her tunic, ignoring the stickiness of her bloodied fingers. The corridor outside was silent, but she expected that could change in an instant. She flattened her back against the wall, glancing either way. Across the hall, the guard was half-dozing, leaning on his spear. This was her opening. Arya padded away, steps gentle as a cat's, rounding the corner before the guard noticed anything amiss. She kept walking, not too slow, not too fast, pretending she belonged there. Then, once safely distant, she broke into a run. Down the twisting stairs, through the half-collapsed courtyard, into the labyrinth of Harrenhal's lesser passages she fled. Her heart was hammering like a drum, but a strange calm began to steal over her. She had done it. By the time the alarm was raised, she intended to be long gone. Jaqen H'ghar had once offered to help her escape. Now might be the time to call in his final debt. She only prayed she could find him before the Lannisters discovered Lord Tywin's corpse. And so it was that the War of the Five Kings shifted in a single savage moment, unseen and unrecorded at first. One of the greatest lords in Westeros lay dead, slain by the hand of a girl who had every reason to hate him. The lion had bled out in a lonely chamber in the greatest, darkest castle in the land. Outside, the restless crows of Harrenhal circled in the sky as if heralding the shape of things to come. Word spread slowly through the fortress at first, whispers carried by servants and lesser knights, until finally those of higher rank heard a rumor that froze their hearts. Lord Tywin Lannister lay murdered in his own solar. In an instant, the entire castle transformed into a hornet's nest of panic and suspicion. Soldiers clattered through the halls in their boots, demanding answers. Officers barked orders, but confusion reigned. How could this happen? No one had seen or heard the attack, and Harrenhal's labyrinth of corridors offered countless hiding places for a killer. No one suspected the small, skinny cupbearer girl at first. With the skill of a hunted animal, Arya drifted among the frightened servants, feigning shock as they all were summoned to gather in the courtyard. She stood among a crowd of trembling peasants, each one terrified that the murderer might be among them. With each passing moment, she expected to feel a hand on her shoulder, to hear a guard's shout. She wondered if the invisible brand of Kinslayer or Kingslayer or some vile label burned upon her forehead. But no one looked twice at her. She was just another trembling waif, a face in the crowd. Ser Gregor Clegane had ridden out days before, leaving only a handful of Lannister men behind, none of them quite certain who commanded now that their lord was gone. The confusion allowed Arya to slip away to find Jaqen Hagar standing in an archway that overlooked the yard, his arms folded. He watched the chaos with an expression of mild curiosity, as though assessing a puzzle. She approached him softly, placing herself near enough to speak without being overheard. "Girl has done something truly bold," he said softly, not looking at her. His voice was calm, lyrical in its own way. "A name was not asked for, yet a life was taken. He deserved it," Arya said in a breath, remembering the blood. Her hand shook at her side. Jaqen glanced at her. "A man does not question your reasons. Death is a gift the many-faced God bestows upon the living. But the ripples of this deed will be felt across the land." Arya trembled. "I need to leave. Now." Jaqen's gaze flicked over her face, then to the swirl of soldiers searching the crowd. "A girl's desire is known. A man can help, but the price must be met." She nodded numbly. He had demanded 3 names before, and she had used them sparingly. Now, with Tywin dead, none of it mattered as much as her survival. "Take me out of here. Take me north, or wherever I can be safe." He inclined his head. "A man will do this. Girl must follow without question, yes." She nodded again, and so began her exodus from Harrenhal. Jaqen ushered her through side passages, instructing her to keep her head down and her eyes averted. They moved through the postern gates under cover of twilight. The guards there had no reason to suspect 2 unremarkable figures departing in the confusion. Dozens of small folk were being sent away or ordered to remain in the yard, uncertain. For a few hours, chaos was her ally. By the time the castle's new castellan, whoever that might be, organized search parties, Arya and Jaqen were gone. They made for the wooded hills beyond Harrenhal's scorched lands. Arya hardly spoke, her mind reeling. She had been so consumed with the act of killing Tywin that she had not fully considered what followed. She rode upon a borrowed mare, skinny as she was. Jaqen led the way with uncanny silence. She felt the urge to speak, to ask him if he judged her, or if he admired her nerve. But she remembered his lessons, how he insisted that silence was sometimes the best cloak. She trusted him just enough to follow. By dawn, they had put many miles between themselves and Harrenhal. They camped near a sluggish stream, concealed by thick brambles. Arya stood in the water to wash the blood from her hands, though she had cleaned them as best she could the night before. The memory of Tywin's eyes in his final moment haunted her. She told herself she felt no guilt, but the echo of that gurgle in his throat unnerved her. She remembered her father's execution, the way King Joffrey had smirked. Tywin might not have swung the sword himself that day, but he had set so many things in motion. She told herself again that this was justice. Jaqen watched her from the bank. "A girl is brave. He was a monster." "Men are many things," Jaqen said obliquely. "Now the world changes, and what does a girl wish to do next?" Arya shrugged, cold water lapping at her ankles. "I want to find my brother, my mother. I want to go north, away from all this." He nodded as though that settled it. "We ride north, then. One day we may part ways, for a man has his own path to walk. But for now we travel together. The many-faced God still has tasks for us." And so they went on. The countryside was war-ravaged, villages burned or abandoned. Soldiers roamed in ragged bands. Yet news traveled, carried by fugitives and whisperers. Tywin Lannister was dead. At first, many refused to believe it. Some insisted it was northern propaganda, a rumor to bolster morale. But as days passed, the truth spread to every corner of the realm. The Wolf King's men told tales around their campfires of how the Lannisters would quake in their boots now. The peasants living in fear of Lannister reprisals dared to hope that the lion's teeth had been blunted. In the Red Keep at King's Landing, a hush fell over the court when the Raven arrived bearing the tidings. Cersei Lannister, golden-haired and proud, reportedly fainted at the news or flew into a rage. Accounts varied. Tyrion Lannister, the imp, had been in the midst of an argument with Grand Maester Pycelle when the message was relayed, and he fell silent, reading it 3 times over to be sure he had not misunderstood. His father, the great Tywin, had been murdered by unknown hands in Harrenhal. The immediate fear was that the entire realm would see House Lannister as vulnerable. Allies might vanish, enemies might pounce. Tyrion felt a sinking dread, for he knew how tenuous their position already was. King Joffrey was a vicious boy, not a ruler who inspired loyalty. With Tywin gone, the Lannisters' iron grip on the realm could slip away like sand. Robb Stark, king in the north, received the news at Riverrun, where he gathered with his banner men. The men cheered, for Tywin had been the architect of their woes. Yet Robb felt little urge to celebrate. Men like Roose Bolton eyed him, waiting to see how he would exploit the sudden shift in the war. Edmure Tully, newly freed from siege, warned that the Lannisters were still dangerous. Tywin's children, Tyrion and Cersei, would not hesitate to strike back. But for the moment, it was a reprieve. The crucial blow they had sought was delivered by an unknown ally in Harrenhal. No one guessed it had been a small wolf in a girl's skin who had made the kill. The War of the Five Kings did not end overnight, but it stumbled, recoiled, became uncertain. In the west, Kevan Lannister tried to hold the family's forces together, but he lacked the fierce authority of his brother. Soldiers in the field began to mutter that the war was lost if Lord Tywin himself could be cut down. Rival lords who had sworn fealty to the Lions weighed their options, some looking to the Tyrells for leadership, others considering discreet overtures to the Starks or the Baratheons. In King's Landing, the whispers rose to a roar. The small council met in frantic sessions, with Cersei screaming for vengeance, Joffrey threatening to have heads on spikes, and Tyrion struggling to keep everything from descending into madness. Varys purred with half-concealed glee, while Littlefinger smiled a smile that invited no trust. The realm was still locked in war, but the puppet master behind so many moves had been cut away. The Lannister pillars of power wobbled. For Arya, each new day was a test of survival, not a day to revel in her success. She traveled with Jaqen, picking her way northward. Occasionally, they split from the main roads to avoid brigands or patrols. The world felt wide and dangerous, but a spark of grim satisfaction burned within her. If any Lion soldier tried to lay hands on her now, she would remember how she slew Tywin Lannister and draw courage from it. One night, they camped near an abandoned mill. Over a small fire, Jaqen roasted a pair of rabbits he had snared. As Arya tore into the meat, her hunger overwhelming her courtesy, she noticed Jaqen watching her with cool curiosity. "What is it?" she asked, wiping grease from her chin. "You have changed since a man first saw you," he replied. "In Yoren's company, you were a small, ragged thing with frightened eyes. Now you carry yourself differently." Arya shrugged, but she felt a twinge of pride. "I've learned that fear is useless. If I hesitate, I die. My father always told me to be brave." Jaqen nodded slowly. "A man wonders if a girl's heart is darker now. A girl has tasted a kill that changed the fate of many." "It had to be done," she said, picking at a small bone. "He killed my father, or at least helped it happen. He would have killed my brother and mother. He was everything I hate." Jaqen's smile was faint. "Hate is a powerful sword to wield. The many-faced God welcomes all offerings, but it is wise to know what shadows we cast." Arya bit her lip. She did not want to dwell on shadows. Her father was avenged in a way, but she still had a family in danger. There was more to do. "Will you stay with me?" she asked, abruptly. "Until I find my mother or my brother's camp?" He considered that, turning the rabbit skewer over the coals. "A man's path diverges in time. But for now, yes. We will walk together a while." In the days and weeks that followed, they drew closer to the regions where Stark bannermen held sway. The land was not entirely safe. There were raiders, broken men, and outlaws. But gradually, Arya sensed the shift in territory. Wolf banners or Tully sigils replaced the red lion here and there. She felt a growing anticipation that she might soon see her brother. In quiet moments, she wondered how Robb would react when he learned who had killed Tywin. Would he be proud? Horrified? Would he look upon his little sister as something changed and monstrous? She told herself it did not matter. They were family, and all that truly mattered was uniting. Yet news was tricky. Rumors abounded. The Lannisters were entrenching near the Golden Tooth. The Tyrells were growing in influence at King's Landing, propping up King Joffrey. Stannis Baratheon was said to be licking his wounds after a failed attack on Blackwater Bay. In the north, the Ironborn were raiding coasts and Theon Greyjoy had taken Winterfell. Each new rumor felt like a betrayal of the world Arya had once known. Winterfell was her home and now it lay under some usurper's control. Her father's seat, taken while she had been forced to serve wine to Tywin Lannister. She dreamt of wolfsome nights, of running through forests beneath a cold moon howling at the sky. She dreamt of her mother's face, tear-streaked and worried. She dreamt of Tywin's final gasp. Each time, she awoke with her fists clenched, heart hammering. One evening, they approached a village that, according to Jaqen, was under the protection of Lord Roose Bolton's men. Arya's stomach twisted at the thought of Roose Bolton, but she had no reason to suspect immediate danger. They needed supplies. It had been too long since they had a decent meal or fresh provisions. They found the village mostly intact, protected by a crude palisade. A banner with the flayed man of House Bolton hung near the entrance, and a half-dozen guards questioned everyone who entered. Jaqen flashed them a piece of parchment that named him as a scout in service to the king in the north, a forgery he had acquired from the pockets of a dead man. The guards eyed Arya but let them in. Inside, they found simple huts, a few merchants hawking salt fish or turnips, and a makeshift stable for travelers. The place was subdued, with men wearing the colors of the dread fort roaming about, but no one seemed especially eager for trouble. Arya's cloak was tattered, her face smudged with dirt. She kept her head down as they moved among the stalls, picking up dried fruit, salted meat, and a handful of other supplies. Yet all at once, a stir ran through the square. A column of riders approached wearing the sigils of House Stark and House Tully. Arya's eyes flew wide. At the head of the group rode a figure she knew instantly. Robb Stark, the young wolf, crowned king in the north. He looked older than she remembered, sterner. His hair was longer, curling around his brow, and the weight of command sat heavy on his shoulders. He was accompanied by a handful of his lords. Great John Umber, Rickard Karstark, Edmure Tully. Bolton men saluted as Robb's party entered the village, and onlookers pressed in, curious to see the king who challenged the lions. Arya's heart pounded. She wanted to cry out, to run to her brother, but fear choked her. What if someone recognized her? She could ruin everything. Yet the desire to reveal herself overwhelmed her caution. She took a tentative step forward as the riders dismounted. Robb spoke with one of the Bolton sergeants. She could hear only snatches of conversation about supply lines, about moving troops westward now that Tywin was gone. She inched closer, ignoring Jaqen's hand on her arm as he silently warned her to remain hidden. Then Robb turned, scanning the crowd. A flicker of memory must have stirred in him, for he paused as his gaze passed over Arya's face. She felt her throat go dry. Her hair was cropped short, her clothes ragged, but still she was a Stark. She saw recognition blooming in his eyes, uncertain yet hopeful. Arya, he breathed, barely audible. Her chest constricted. Tears sprang to her eyes. She took another step forward. Robb, she said in a small voice. And then they were moving toward each other, ignoring the stares of soldiers and villagers alike. She ran into his arms, felt his warmth and the rough texture of his cloak. For an instant, she was a little girl again, hugging her big brother in the yard at Winterfell. Robb's voice trembled. I thought you were lost. The Lannisters said gods, Arya. He cupped her face in his hands, eyes brimming with tears he tried to contain. Where have you been? How did you? Arya clung to him, sobbing. I was at Harrenhal. They made me serve Lord Tywin. Robb, I killed him. I killed Tywin Lannister. The words burst out of her. Robb's mouth fell open, his eyes widening. Around them, lords and soldiers exchanged baffled looks. Someone laughed nervously as though Arya had made a grim jest, but Robb saw the fire in her eyes, the steel in her voice. He did not doubt her. He pressed a hand to her head as if to cradle the enormity of her confession. You did? He managed. How, we heard rumors that it was some assassin. Arya, what have you done? I had to, she insisted, wiping tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. He was going to destroy us. I had a chance, and I took it. Robb's expression was a storm of emotions, relief at finding his sister alive, horror at what she had been forced to do, awe that she had succeeded. He swallowed hard and pulled her close again. By the gods, you're safe now. You're safe. I-oh, Arya. Those gathered around stared with a mix of astonishment and uncertain disbelief. The great John barked a laugh. The little wolf has more bite than we knew. Edmure Tully murmured, if this is true, it changes everything. My lords, the Lannisters have lost their head, literally. Karstark frowned, but nodded. We must confirm it, but if the rumors say Tywin was slain at Harrenhal, then Arya Stark might well have done it. She was captive there, wasn't she? Robb kept his arm firmly around Arya's shoulders, as if afraid she might vanish again. She's my sister. I believe her. I don't know how or why, but it's done. He studied Arya's face, concern etched on his own. We'll talk more later in private. The reunion was cut short by the pressing demands of the War Council. Robb needed to move his men, and swiftly. He ordered that Arya be given new clothes, a place to rest, and a warm meal. She wanted to remain at his side, but he insisted she stay safe while he met with the Bolton officers. With reluctance, she let him go, comforted by the knowledge that they were at least in the same place now, bound by blood that no war could sever. Jaqen lingered at a distance, unseen by most, a silent observer. He watched Arya embrace her brother, and for a moment, there was a softness in his usually inscrutable eyes. Then he melted into the crowd. She later searched for him, but found no trace. Part of her grieved that he was gone, but another part accepted it. He had been her guide, a protector in a time of chaos, but his path lay elsewhere. She was with her kin now. Over the next hours, Arya found herself swept into a whirlwind of logistical planning. She was given a small chamber in a half-burned inn that had been repurposed for officers. Robb came to see her at dusk. Without ceremony, he just wrapped her in another hug, as if to assure himself she was real. They talked late into the night. Arya told him everything. How she'd been captured, forced to serve Tywin, how she had stolen scraps of information, how she found her chance to strike. Robb's disbelief and awe grew with each detail. He tried to shield his shock, but she could see it. She tried not to dwell on the horror of what she'd done, framing it instead as a necessary kill to avenge their father. Robb listened without judgment, though sorrow lingered in his eyes. Father would not have wanted you to become... He hesitated, searching for words. A killer. Arya finished for him, bitterness in her voice. We don't get to choose what the war makes us. He nodded grimly. No, I suppose not. They spoke of their mother, Lady Catelyn, who was off negotiating with Walder Frey or forging alliances with the Tullus. They spoke of Sansa, still trapped in King's Landing with that vicious boy king. They spoke of Bran and Rickon, rumored to have fled Winterfell after Theon's treachery. The realm was in turmoil, but at least they too had each other now. At first light, the new day brought urgent decisions. Robb's advisors pointed out that, with Tywin Lannister dead, the window was open to strike a decisive blow against Lannister power in the Western lands. Yet they also worried about the South, where King's Landing might rally under the Tyrell's leadership or possibly summon other allies. Ultimately, Robb resolved to push west, to take the fight to the Lannisters' doorstep before they could recover. He would march with the bulk of his forces on the Gold Road, aiming to claim strategic positions near the Golden Tooth. Arya wanted to ride with him. The thought of parting again so soon gnawed at her, but Robb insisted it was too dangerous. You've done enough, little sister. You're brave, but I don't want you anywhere near the next battlefield. Arya bristled. I'm not a child, Robb. I can fight. He shook his head. I know you can fight, but your safety matters to me more than anything. This war has taken enough from us. She did not relent easily, but in the end, the promise of eventually reuniting with their mother overcame her stubbornness. Robb arranged for a small escort to take Arya north, hopefully to find Lady Catelyn or at least a secure stronghold where she could be protected. Before they parted, Robb and Arya walked together along the palisade, looking out over the ragged countryside. Soldiers packed up tents and loaded wagons, the clamor of activity filling the morning air. I can't believe you did it, Robb said quietly, not for the first time. Tywin Lannister, you struck a blow I never dared dream possible. Arya stared out, her face set. He killed father. He was the reason for everything that happened to our family. Robb nodded, placing a hand on her shoulder. We'll make the rest of them pay. But be careful, Arya. Don't let killing become too easy. She glanced up at him. It's not. It never was. He hugged her once more, then left her to the care of a half-dozen Stark men-at-arms, trustworthy soldiers sworn to guard her with their lives. She mounted a sturdy palfrey. As she rode away from the village, she looked back to see Robb astride his own warhorse, leading his army west. She felt a pang of longing, but also a sense of pride. She had done her part, in her own bloody, desperate way. The escort led Arya north, skirting major roads to avoid conflict. Every now and then, they came upon traveling merchants or peasants seeking refuge. The world still reeled from Tywin's death. The news preceded them everywhere they went. She heard men boast that the Lannisters were finished, that the North would win. Others worried that a cornered lion was most dangerous. She kept her identity secret. Her escort referred to her as simply the lady, and no one asked too many questions. Some days, she thought about Tywin's final breath, the flash of his eyes. She did not regret it, not truly, but she knew she had changed, and she wondered what her father would think if he could see her now. A Stark must always be true to their word, he used to say, and take no joy in killing, but do what must be done. That was what she had done, what must be done. Time slipped by, the war continued. The next great shock that rippled through the land came when the Lannisters attempted a hasty alliance with the Tyrells, binding House Lannister to the powerful Rose of the Reach. Margaery Tyrell was still betrothed to King Joffrey, but with Tywin gone, that alliance seemed more precarious. Many Tyrell lords questioned whether they should chain themselves to an unstable boy king and a family in decline. Rival claimants to the throne seized the moment. In the Stormlands, some rallied behind Stannis once more. Renly's ghost lingered in men's hearts, but there was no direct challenger from that line left. Meanwhile, the Iron Throne itself stood upon shaky foundations. In the capital, Cersei struggled to maintain order. She poured her frustrations on Tyrion, who found himself torn between the need to protect his family and the cold truth that Joffrey's rule was a liability. Tensions flared, with the common folk of King's Landing rioting over food shortages and the high cost of war. Tyrion did what he could to hold the city together, forging uneasy truces with the Tyrells and sending out ravens to call more men to defend them. But the question lingered, who truly led the Lannisters now that Tywin was gone? Kevan Lannister tried to exert authority, but his presence was overshadowed by the Queen Regent and the chaotic impulses of the king. On a night thick with tension, Cersei confronted Tyrion in the small council chamber. "You must do more," she hissed, pacing restlessly, her green eyes blazing. "My father's memory alone cannot keep our bannermen in line. We need to crush the Starks to show them we still have teeth. If you will not do it, I will." Tyrion rubbed his brow wearily. "And how do you propose we do that, dear sister? The gold cloaks are stretched thin, our coffers are not bottomless, and the Tyrells are already pressing for more influence. The Starks are emboldened, and rumor says they've retaken parts of the West. We need time to consolidate, not rash aggression." Cersei slammed a hand on the table. "Our father would never have let them march so boldly. He'd have had a plan." Tyrion sighed. "Our father is dead, in case you hadn't heard, and we can't resurrect him. We must adapt." She glared at him, silent fury etched on her face. "I blame you," she spat. "If you had been at Harrenhal, or if you had arranged more competent guards, this never would have happened. That little Stark bitch." Tyrion stiffened, a surge of anger welling up. "I did not kill father, nor did I fail in some trivial duty. Your father, our father, made the choice to go to Harrenhal, made the choice to carry on as though he were untouchable. This is war, Cersei. Death can come for anyone." She turned away, her back rigid. "Then perhaps it will come for you, dear brother, if you continue to fail." Tyrion said nothing, bitterly aware that Cersei's madness only grew with each passing day. Tywin had been her anchor. Without him, she was adrift, consumed by her desire to maintain power, to see Joffrey reign unchallenged. Tyrion feared for the realm under such leadership. He took comfort only in the knowledge that the Tyrells, cunning as they were, would not let the Lannister ship sink too readily if they could benefit. For now at least. Battle after battle flared across the war-torn land. The Northmen pressed their advantage in the west. Robb Stark's star was on the rise, each victory brought more lords to his side. The news that Tywin Lannister had been slain by none other than Arya Stark turned into legend, repeated and embellished in each telling. Songs were composed of the wolf girl who avenged her sire. Some doubted the truth, but the story spread like wildfire. Arya Stark became, to many, a symbol of the North's unyielding spirit. She, however, found it surreal to hear her own legend recounted by traveling minstrels. She spent her days quietly, under guard in a small castle where she awaited word from her mother. She chafed at the idle comfort, preferring to train with a wooden sword in the courtyard or help the healers attend to wounded soldiers. The short sword needle was gone, lost in the chaos of her capture, but she acquired a new blade of castle-forged steel. She practiced until her arms ached, trying to merge Sirio Farrell's water dancer style with the savage practicality she had learned on the road. At last, a raven arrived for her. Lady Catelyn Stark was nearby at a place called the Twins, forging new alliances. Arya wasted no time. She convinced her guards that Robb wanted them to deliver her to their mother. They complied, eager to reunite the family. Riding hard for days, they eventually arrived at the great crossing of the Twins where Lord Walder Frey held dominion. Arya dreaded the old man, whose reputation for spite and cunning was well known, but the chance to see her mother blotted out any other fear. They found Catelyn Stark in a modest solar within the Twins, eyes dark with fatigue, face lined with worry. She rose the instant she saw Arya, her composure cracking, tears shining. "Arya," she exclaimed, voice trembling. "My precious girl." Arya stumbled into her mother's arms, a sob tearing from her throat. They clung to each other as though to banish every terrible memory. After a long moment, Catelyn pulled back, hands on Arya's shoulders, gaze searching her face. "They told me, they said you killed Tywin Lannister." Arya drew a shuddering breath. "I did. I had to." Her mother's eyes brimmed with sorrow and pride and confusion all at once. "Oh, my brave girl. We will talk of it, there's so much I need to know. But I'm just so relieved you're alive." They sat together, away from the prying eyes of the Freys, while Arya recounted her story once more. Each retelling made it feel more distant, as though she spoke of some other girl. Her mother listened gravely. When Arya came to the part where she stabbed Tywin, Lady Catelyn closed her eyes, as if recalling Eddard Stark's face. Perhaps in her mind, this was a measure of vengeance. But she said nothing condemning. She only held Arya's hand in her own. Over the next days, Arya learned that King Robb sought to solidify alliances with the Freys to ensure safe passage across the river. Walder Frey was as prickly as rumored, but the death of Tywin had changed the landscape. Frey wanted to tie his fortunes to the Ascendant Star, and Robb's vow to wed one of his daughters, despite the complexities of love and duty, sealed the agreement. The war was far from over, but with the Lannisters in disarray, the Starks and Tullis had a powerful edge. Yet Lady Catelyn never forgot the other threats. She heard rumors of unrest in the capital, talk of the Tyrells pulling strings behind Joffrey's throne, of the Greyjoys raiding the northern coast. There were too many battles to fight and not enough warriors. And Winterfell remained under Ironborn control, her younger son's fate uncertain. Though Catelyn wanted to keep Arya close, she also knew the north needed to be reclaimed. She and Arya talked quietly one evening by the warmth of a small hearth in the Freys' cramped guest quarters. "We have to take back Winterfell," Arya insisted, her voice firm. "We can't let Theon hold it." Catelyn sighed, grief flickering across her features. "We will. Robb is determined to do so once he's dealt with the Lannisters in the west. There's word the Ironborn hold only the castle itself, with the surrounding countryside hostile to them. But it's not an easy thing, and your brothers, if they are there, we must be careful." Arya's tone hardened. "We'll get them back." Her mother squeezed her hand. "Yes, we must." She studied Arya's face. "You seem so grown now." "I had to grow," Arya said simply. The night wore on, and talk of war weighed heavily upon them. Each passing day brought new tidings, some good, some dire. The Freys' halls thrummed with tension. Yet amidst the gloom, Arya found a quiet sense of belonging once more. She had her family, at least part of it. They might be battered, but they were Starks, and Starks endured. Meanwhile, far away in King's Landing, the Lannisters reeled. Tywin's foo. Neril was a subdued affair, overshadowed by political tensions and the fear that their foes were closing in. Cersei dressed in black, her face set like stone. Joffrey scowled through the rites, bored and irritated that the city was not focusing on him. Tyrion stood apart from them, his thoughts churning with plans to stave off the worst. The High Septon presided over the ceremony, droning prayers to the Seven. Onlookers murmured that Tywin Lannister's body was not preserved as well as it might have been, that a foul odor wafted through the great September. Some whispered it was a curse from the gods, that Tywin's sins had come back to haunt him. Others dismissed it as rumor. But the effect was the same, the once mighty lion had fallen. The stench of mortality clung to the Lannisters now. In the days that followed, Kevan Lannister tried to rally what forces he could. Word came that Riverrun was secure under the Tullis, the Starks were pushing west, and the Tyrells were lukewarm about supporting a war that might not yield them further advantage. The situation looked grim. The Queen Regent grew more hysterical by the day, lashing out at anyone she perceived as disloyal. Joffrey's cruelty escalated, culminating in public floggings and humiliations of suspected traitors. Tyrion recognized the trajectory. They were losing the moral ground and the people were growing bolder in their hatred. The city might soon riot in earnest or even welcome a Stark or Baratheon incursion. Amid that climate, the seeds planted by Arya Stark's blade took root. House Lannister's downfall was not instantaneous but unstoppable. The lion still had claws, but with no unifying will behind them, each slash bled its own resources. 1,000 miles away, the young wolf in the west consolidated his hold. Winter was still coming, as the old saying went, but the north had found new life. Arya Stark, the girl who once served wine in Harrenhal, had made a single strike that cut the head off the greatest lion in the land. She might never sit on a throne, never wear a crown, but her act reverberated across kingdoms. In the hush of midnight, while the world slept, a blade had ended a legacy and ushered in a new chapter of the war. Still, blood called for blood. The realm would not see peace anytime soon. For every lord who applauded Tywin's death, another plotted revenge. For every territory freed from Lannister oppression, another saw a wave of chaos. The War of the Five Kings might one day be known by another name, perhaps the War of the Wolf Girl's Blade, or simply the War of Vengeance. Historians would debate the turning points, but all would agree on one thing. Harrenhal, that cursed fortress, claimed another victim and the realm was forever changed. By the time Arya and her escort left the Frey's domain, the sky was cast in iron-gray clouds that threatened rain. She rode with a new sense of purpose. Her mother had remained behind for more negotiations, trusting the Frey's promises. Arya could not shake her lingering distrust of Lord Walder, but she kept her misgivings to herself. Lady Catelyn insisted she had matters well in hand and that Robb would soon arrive to cement their alliance. Arya's place for now was to accompany a contingent heading north to secure more loyal lands. On the road, every gust of wind whispered of a changing world. Autumn leaves fell from skeletal trees, drifting across the rutted path. The men-at-arms who rode with Arya were stiff but courteous, determined to keep her safe. At night, by the campfires, they told stories of Robb's triumphs and repeated rumors about the downfall of the Lannisters. She listened with a mix of pride and foreboding. She knew that war was never so simple. Tywin's death did not erase the countless swords still sworn to House Lannister, nor the cunning of men like Petyr Baelish or the spider's webs spun by Varys. Yet for all that, a measure of hope glimmered. Perhaps the bloodshed would slow. Perhaps the realms might find some measure of peace, if not soon, then eventually. She often thought about her father's face, how gentle he had looked in her memories even when delivering stern lessons. Would he be proud of her now, or frightened by the hardness in her eyes? She recalled the feel of Tywin's blood on her hands. There were nights she lay awake, staring at the stars, recalling the exact moment the blade broke his skin. Sometimes she told herself it was justice. Other times she simply accepted that it was war. In the quiet between watch shifts, she practiced water dancing stances, stepping lightly in the darkness, feeling her blade slice the air with precision. She was not the same girl who once chased cats in the Red Keep. The rain finally broke as they neared an outpost manned by House Glover's soldiers, a stout palisade in a wind-blown clearing. The man in charge, a thick-bearded captain, immediately recognized Arya as a Stark, for she bore her sigil on a modest brooch pinned at her collar. He bowed low, pledging to escort her the rest of the way to Deepwood Motte, where Lady Sibel Glover kept watch over the northwestern coast. Word had spread that the Ironborn were raiding further south now, leaving some parts of the north less harried. Still, vigilance was necessary. In the days that followed, Arya gradually felt the chill of northern air against her cheeks. She was coming home, though the true seat of the Starks, Winterfell, was still out of reach, occupied or burnt, depending on which rumor one believed. That knowledge weighed heavily on her. She had avenged her father, but Winterfell remained in the wrong hands. Her brothers were unaccounted for or rumored dead. The war still raged. Even so, she pressed on, determined to do her part. They arrived at Deepwood Motte near dusk, greeted by Lady Glover's soldiers who watched from the battlements with interest. Once again, Arya's identity spurred excitement and relief. She was ushered into the hall where Lady Glover received her with warmth. The hall was no grand feast chamber. Deepwood Motte was a simple fortress, built for defense against Ironborn incursions. But the large hearth fire glowed bright, and Arya welcomed the warmth on her travel-sore limbs. Lady Glover, a strong-featured woman in her middle years, bowed with genuine respect. "Lady Arya Stark, we had heard tales of your courage. I am honored to receive you here." Arya managed a humble nod. "I'm no lady. Not really. But I thank you. We've come seeking rest, and we'd like to coordinate with any loyal Stark bannermen in the region." Of course, Lady Glover said. My husband was taken captive by the Ironborn for a time, but we have reclaimed some measure of our holdings. We stand with King Robb. Arya's heart clenched at the mention of Robb, wishing she could see him again. But she understood that war scattered families to the winds. She was grateful at least to find these loyal allies. Over a simple meal of stewed venison and crusty bread, she spoke of her journey, carefully omitting the darkest details of Tywin's death. The men-at-arms recounted news from the south, how Robb was steadily pushing the Lannisters back, how the Freys had pledged troops, how the Tyrells' loyalty in King's Landing wavered. A new phase of the war was unfolding, though no one dared predict how it would end. Over the next fortnight, Arya lent her sword to Lady Glover's efforts. She joined patrols that scouted the edges of Ironborn-controlled territory, riding through dense pine forests and rocky shorelines. She saw the scars of war everywhere, burned farmsteads, broken watchtowers, the remnants of Ironborn raiding camps. Yet she also saw the resilience of the North. Small folk emerged from hidden glens and fishing hamlets, still proud to call themselves subjects of House Stark, eager to share what little they had to help drive out the invaders. Each day, Arya's confidence grew. She sparred with the Glover guards, honing her technique. She no longer hesitated when drawing her blade. The memory of Tywin's murder lived within her, a reminder of what she could do if driven by necessity. Sometimes she caught glimpses of pity in the older knight's eyes, pity that a young girl had been forced into such a world. She waved it away. She was who she was, a product of these violent times. On a crisp morning, she stood atop the walls of Deepwood Motte, gazing northward. She felt the wind tug at her hair, smelled the faint tang of salt from the sea. She could almost sense Winterfell's presence in the distance, calling her like an old friend. One of the guards sidled up beside her. Lady Arya, he said, a hesitant deference in his tone. We've a party returning from the latest raid. They say the Ironborn are retreating along the coast, sailing off with what loot they have. Might be they're giving up their hold on our shore. She exhaled a pale wisp of breath in the cold air. That's good news for the north. But Winterfell? Word is, Winterfell remains under the Greyjoy boy's shadow, but many think he'll flee once King Robb or any sizable force arrives. She nodded, the distant ache in her heart growing sharper. She thanked the guard and returned to her chamber, pondering her next steps. Part of her yearned to join Robb and push the Ironborn out of Winterfell with steel and fire. But she also understood that her mother had wanted her safe, that her presence on the battlefield could complicate matters for her brother. She was trapped between duty and her own fierce desire for vengeance. That night, she knelt by a narrow window slit, the moonlight painting her face silver. She closed her eyes and remembered the names she used to whisper each night, her litany of those who had wronged her and her family. Back then, Tywin Lannister was near the top of that list. She crossed him off in the most final way possible. Joffrey Baratheon, the Queen, Ser Maren Trant, the Hound, Island Payne. There were still names in her prayer. But she found her voice trailing off. The world had changed, and so had she. Perhaps it was enough that she had ended Tywin. Perhaps not. She let the silence cradle her, feeling the swirl of conflicting emotions. Sometime later, she rose and gazed upon her reflection in a dented piece of polished metal that served as a mirror. Her face was thinner, her eyes harder. She saw a spark of wolfish determination in them. If the war demanded more blood, she would not shirk from it. But a small part of her longed for the quiet hills of home, for a day when she might run through the Godwood with her siblings, unburdened by the weight of her deeds. She whispered to the darkness, I'm Arya Stark of Winterfell, and I have only begun to fight. Out beyond those walls, the war raged on, clashes of steel, the roar of siege engines, the cries of ravens bearing messages of alliances and betrayals. Far in the south, the Lannister hold slipped further each day, beset by the Tyrells' ambitions and the resentments of a populace grown weary of cruelty. In the west, Robb Stark advanced like a thunderhead, determined to shatter the remnants of Lannister power. The rivers and fields of the Seven Kingdoms ran red with the cost of vengeance. Yet there was promise, too. The unyielding strength of the north was no longer a faint memory. Winter might come, but the wolves prowled once more, guided in part by the savage courage of a girl who had done the unthinkable. From Harrenhal's cursed halls to the restless capital, Tywin Lannister's death echoed through every court and hamlet. No matter what future songs would be sung, one refrain would remain, the day the lion fell to the hidden blade of the wolf girl. And so Arya Stark pressed onward, neither hero nor villain, but a survivor shaped by loss and vengeance. Each step she took carried her deeper into the unraveling tapestry of war, a war she had changed with one swift, merciless stroke. No matter how many more battles would be fought, that act would stand as a turning point, proof that even the greatest lords could not escape the fury of those they had wronged. In a realm where songs often told of gallant knights and mighty kings, the ballads would forever recall the night a small, fierce wolf tore out the lion's throat at Harrenhal and in doing so set the course of kingdoms. As the gloaming deepened over Deepwood Motte, Arya Stark stood on the ramparts with the wind tugging at her hair, her eyes fixed toward the east. She had been here longer than she ever expected, far from Harrenhal where she had taken her fateful vengeance. No one had planned it this way, not even Arya herself, yet the world was an endless tapestry of unintended paths. Down in the courtyard, soldiers of House Glover moved about with purposeful strides, their breath curling in the cold air as they inspected weapons and loaded supply carts. Lady Sibel Glover's firm leadership kept her small stronghold running like clockwork, despite the persistent threat of Ironborn lurking along the sea. The Glover men spoke with grim satisfaction of how the raiders had slunk away from much of the northwestern coast, perhaps deciding they had more to gain further south. Yet all Arya cared about was Winterfell. Night had properly fallen by the time she descended the wooden steps into the yard, a battered cloak wrapped around her shoulders. The memory of Tywin Lannister's blood remained as vivid as it had been the day she fled Harrenhal. She had grown accustomed to the swirl of conflicting emotions that haunted her, a fierce pride in having avenged her father and a disquieting knowledge that she had crossed a boundary from which one never fully returned. She could not regret it, but in her unguarded moments she sometimes recalled the slight tremor in her fingers, the hot rush of Tywin's lifeblood drenching her palms. A pair of guards stood watch near the gates, thick-bearded men in boiled leather bearing the Glover sigil. One nodded to Arya as she passed, respectful enough to keep his curiosity contained. Many in the fortress recognized her name, though few had seen her face until she arrived. She was just Arya to them, young, lean, with a wolf's watchful gaze and a blade strapped to her side. But rumors traveled faster than ravens. Whispers claimed that the youngest daughter of Lord Eddard Stark had done the unthinkable at Harrenhal, slaying Tywin Lannister as though he were nothing more than an old man in a lonely room. Some men struggled to believe it, but the swirl of rumors was impossible to ignore. Stables and storehouses ringed the courtyard. She made her way toward the small building where the horses were kept, inhaling the pungent scents of hay and manure. Inside, the warmth of the animals greeted her more kindly than the winter air. Lantern light fell across the straw-strewn floor, revealing a handful of grooms tending to the horses. Arya went to scratch the ears of a chestnut mare that had served her well on a recent patrol. One of the grooms, a boy not much older than Arya, peered at her with wide eyes. He had likely heard the rumors too. She said nothing, just offered the mare a piece of carrot she had tucked in her pocket. Footsteps sounded behind her. When she turned, she found Lady Glover herself approaching, wrapped in a woolen cloak and exuding an air of quiet authority. She was not a woman who smiled easily, but there was a frankness in her gaze that Arya found reassuring. "You're restless?" Lady Glover said without preamble. Arya let her hand slide away from the mare's muzzle. "Aye, my lady." Glover studied her, then nodded as though confirming her own guess. "You've done good work here, helping the patrols drive away what remained of the Ironborn near our coast. But I see how you linger on the walls, always looking east. You yearn to leave." Arya's mouth tensed. "I need to be closer to Winterfell. Closer to my mother. Or my brothers if they're alive. Or both." There was a flicker of sympathy in the older woman's face. "Deepwood Motte is not Winterfell, that's certain. And word has reached us that King Robb pushes further west, seizing key strongholds once sworn to the Lannisters, while the Freys supposedly prepare safe crossings for his army. As for your mother, she remains at the Twins for the moment, so far as any raven has told." "Do you mean to travel there?" Arya hesitated. "I'm not sure. If my mother wanted me at the Twins, I believe she'd have summoned me. And I suspect she'd rather I remain out of danger." A wry smile almost formed on her lips. "But staying idle doesn't suit me." Lady Glover nodded. "I've heard that said about you. You're not one to sit still while war rages. Yet if you want to see Winterfell reclaimed, you may not need to wait long. Our scouts say the Ironborn are weak there, likely only holding on by terror and the advantage of those walls. The Greyjoy who took it, Theon, has few allies left in the north." Arya felt the name flit through her mind, stinging like a wasp. Theon Greyjoy had been a ward at Winterfell, had trained in the yard with Robb, Bran, Jon, and occasionally Arya herself. The notion that he had turned on them, taking advantage of the chaos to seize her home, was a bitter betrayal. "Then perhaps I can help," she said. "I've learned more than just water dancing these last months." Glover's expression grew pensive. "You may. Though your mother wanted you kept safe, you're hardly a child in need of swaddling. Deepwood Mott will muster what men we can once we have direct word from King Robb or from your mother confirming the plan for Winterfell. But you know how slow the ravens are and how scattered our forces remain. I can't wait for all the ravens to come and go, Arya said. If there's a chance to help from here, I want to. Or I could travel to your bannermen and rally them in the name of the Starks. Whatever it takes. Lady Glover regarded her thoughtfully for a moment. I'll consider how best to use you. No, don't bristle, it isn't an insult. You're a Stark, not some hired sword. But that name carries weight, particularly now that the realm suspects it was you who slew Tywin Lannister. Men are superstitious. Some might fear you or place you on a pedestal. Either way, your presence can spur them to fight. Arya swallowed. It still struck her as surreal to be spoken of in hushed tones, as though she was both a child and a legend. I just want to see our enemies driven out. I want to stand in Winterfell's great hall again. There is no shortage of men who want that, Lady Glover said, her voice low and resolute. Rest assured, we're not ignoring the castle's plight. But we are a small house compared to some, and the Frey's intentions remain uncertain. Our next steps must be planned carefully. Until then, remain vigilant, help where you can, and trust that your chance to act will come. War spares none who yearn to prove themselves. Arya managed a respectful bow of her head. She understood. Winterfell was no minor target, and even if the Ironborn there were few, the risk of bold action without coordination was obvious. But she felt each day slip past like grains of sand, a mounting pressure in her chest as though the ghosts of her father and all her lost siblings cried out for her to do something. As Lady Glover departed, Arya placed a final pat on the mare's neck, then stepped out of the stables into the cold night. Snow had begun drifting from the sky, the first gentle flurries that hinted at the winter to come. She turned her steps toward the small barracks near the keep, where a portion of the Glover soldiers and a handful of the men from her own Stark escort quartered. The corridor inside smelled of tallow and damp wool. A low murmur of conversation spilled from one of the side chambers. Stepping inside, she found 3 soldiers hunched over a rough wooden table. Heads close together as they spoke in subdued tones. They glanced up when she entered. Lady Arya, one said, standing a bit too quickly, nearly knocking over his cup of ale. Another set aside a worn deck of cards, his expression halfway between awe and embarrassment. They were still not used to addressing a young girl as lady, especially one rumored to have ended Tywin Lannister. It's all right, Arya said, leaning a shoulder against the doorway. No need for ceremony. She cast an idle glance around. I'm restless, so I thought I'd see what you lot were up to. One of them, John Bulwer was his name, though he served House Glover, nodded politely. We were just talking about the next patrol. Word is some outlaws were spotted near the forest edges. Could be broken men from the war. Arya perked up. Do you have orders to pursue them? Bulwer shrugged. We're to keep watch, but I doubt Lady Glover wants a big expedition. We're spread thin enough. These outlaws might be dangerous or might just be hungry peasants turned robber. He hesitated, eyeing Arya. You thinking of joining a scouting party? She considered. Could be something to do. Might be they're just desperate men who fled their lords. Or could be they're worse. In either case, I'd rather be out in the field than pacing these corridors. The soldiers exchanged glances. They knew better than to casually deny the request of a Stark, especially one with her reputation. Finally, Bulwer said, we'll likely ride at first light to check the old mill near the forest. You can come if you wish. But, my lady, I've heard rumors of your skill. If things turn grim, we'd rely on that. Arya offered a small, humorless smirk. You can rely on me. But I'm not the only sword you'll have. I'm just a hand among many. They nodded, though she saw the flicker of wariness in their eyes. Good, she thought. Let them not be too eager or overconfident. She had no illusions about her skill, she was quick and determined, but she was no seasoned knight. Her advantage was often in surprise and in the raw nerve that had grown within her since the day she saw her father die. She bid them a curt good night and made her way to her small chamber in the keep, a simple affair with a narrow cot and a single shuttered window. The walk there passed by an alcove bearing the Glover sigil, a mailed fist. Arya thought about how House Glover had always been loyal to House Stark, though their fortunes had wavered under the might of the Ironborn. But loyalty endured. It was more than she could say of some houses that had bent the knee to the Lannisters under duress. More than she could say of Theon Greyjoy, whose face hovered in her memory like a bitter refrain. Her chamber was cold enough that she could see her breath. With a grunt, she set about lighting the small hearth. Her father had taught her practical tasks, while Sansa learned sewing and courtesy. Arya had followed her own path. She coaxed the embers into flame, then settled on her cot, drawing her knees up. She stared at the flicker of firelight dancing across the walls. Beyond these stones, the night stretched wide and winter loomed. Yet a spark of determination flared in her chest. She pictured Winterfell's courtyard under snow, the crisp hush of the godwood, the warmth of her family. If the war had taught her anything, it was that the old ways of thinking, those illusions of safety, were gone. But perhaps if the North united, they could forge a new safety, a battered but unbreakable bastion for the Starks and their people. She drifted into a shallow sleep, haunted by half-formed dreams. In them, Tywin Lannister's lifeless eyes stared accusingly. The walls of Winterfell loomed, dark and scorched, Theon's silhouette outlined in flame. Then the scene shifted, and she was a wolf padding through snowdrifts, sniffing the air for the scents of her scattered pack. The dream dissolved into swirling shapes, and she woke with a start at dawn, the dying hearth all but ashes. A dull light crept around the edges of the shutter. Her breath plumed in the chill. She rose stiffly, rubbed warmth into her arms, and splashed water on her face from the basin. She pulled on her boots and belt, then slung her sword across her back in the style she found comfortable. If there was to be a morning patrol, she intended to be ready. Down in the courtyard, she found Jon Bulwer and 4 other soldiers already mounted and waiting. Frost rhymed the wooden beams and stones, and the horses stamped the ground impatiently. Arya approached, nodding to each in turn. Bulwer held the reins of a spare horse, a sturdy palfrey. "Shall we?" she asked. Her breath curled in the cold. Bulwer handed her the reins. "We'll head east along the old track. Keep eyes sharp for signs of movement. If these outlaws are near the mill, we'll know soon enough." They rode out beneath the half-raised portcullis, saluted by 2 guards in Glover colors. The road beyond Deepwood Motte was muddy from recent snowmelt, though patches of ice still clung here and there in the forest shade. Arya let her horse follow the trotting pace set by Bulwer, who led in single file to make minimal noise. The bare, wintry trees pressed in, their branches rattling like bones in the wind. As they proceeded, Arya found her mind drifting. She recalled the numerous woodland rides she had taken around Winterfell with her siblings, back when everything seemed so simple. Or the frantic flight through the riverlands after her father was executed, hiding among commoners, always afraid of the next threat. This ride, at least, was somewhat safer. She was among men she could trust, and she bore the name Stark openly. If outlaws lurked here, they would not stand a chance against 6 armed riders, or so Arya believed. A mile passed in silence, broken only by the crunch of hoofs. Then Bulwer raised a hand to halt them. He pointed ahead where the forest opened into a clearing with a dilapidated structure that must have been the old mill. Thin smoke curled from the remnants of a collapsed roof. A scattering of footprints had churned the muddy ground. They dismounted, tying their horses to a low branch. Bulwer signaled for caution. Arya drew her sword. She scanned the clearing. The mill was barely more than rotted beams and half-tumbled stone, but the presence of smoke meant someone was inside or had been recently. One of the soldiers, a tall fellow named Darryl, crept to the left, moving with surprising stealth for a man in armor. Arya followed Bulwer around the other side, her pulse thrumming with the tension of possible combat. A sudden rustle near a sagging doorway made them freeze. A figure stumbled out, so thin and ragged that Arya almost mistook him for a living corpse. He wore tattered clothing and no cloak. His eyes were wide with panic. At the sight of armed soldiers, he raised trembling hands. "Mercy, my lords! Mercy! We're starving, not thieves." Bulwer hissed for him to be still, sword at the ready. "Who else is inside?" The man shook so violently that Arya feared he might collapse. "My sons, my wife, another family, we have nowhere else to go. The war took her home. Please, don't kill us." Arya's grip on her blade relaxed fractionally. War had made so many refugees, she had seen them scattered across every corner of the realm. "We won't harm you if you haven't done harm to others," she said, surprising herself with the authority in her tone. Bulwer shot her a glance. Then he nodded. "Search the place carefully, though. If there are men inside with weapons, we'll need to know." 2 more men emerged, though they looked as wretched as the first. Their cheeks were hollow, eyes sunken. They carried no visible weapons aside from a crude wooden club. The soldier named Darryl disarmed them with practiced ease, tossing the club aside. Inside the mill, there was only a smoldering fire pit, a handful of ragged children, and 2 women who clutched each other in fear. Arya felt a heaviness settle in her gut. These were not bandits living large on stolen goods. They were broken people barely surviving. Bulwer sighed, lowering his sword. "We heard outlaws were raiding travelers in these parts." "Is that you?" "No," croaked the first man. "I swear on the gods, we only beg or gather berries when we can. The men you speak of passed by a fortnight ago, took what little we had, said they were kingless men who served none. They killed one of our neighbors who tried to stop them. We've been hiding here since." Arya exchanged a look with Bulwer. She believed the man. She had seen this story repeated 1,000 times across the war-ravaged lands. Peasants turned desperate, forced to hide from roving brigands with no lord to protect them. She sheathed her sword. You'd best come back with us to Deepwood, Mott. There may be a place for you to shelter, or at least a warm meal. You won't survive here much longer. The man's eyes welled with tears. Truly, my lady? You'd let us in. Arya felt a pang. She was no lady of the castle, not really, but she had the authority of her name. Yes, Lady Glover is fair. She'll offer you food and a place to sleep if you pledge no harm in return. Bulwer motioned to the others. We'll gather them up. Let's see if we can salvage anything from this mill. Then we'll head back. It was a slow, sad procession. 3 exhausted men, 2 trembling women, and several children clinging to the adults' skirts. They were too weak even to walk quickly, so Bulwer had 2 of his men take the children up on their horses. Arya walked behind them, sword at her hip, scanning the trees for any sign of threat. She felt a swell of grim satisfaction that at least these people would find shelter. If the rumors of outlaws still held true, the search continued. But for now, they had done some small good. By the time they returned to Deepwood Mott, midday had come and gone. The refugees were whisked to the kitchen yard, where Lady Glover's stewards examined them, preparing a meager meal of oat porridge and hot broth. Word spread quickly. Arya Stark and the patrol had found more war-torn small folk in dire need. The talk among the soldiers turned from outlaws to pity for these unfortunates. Late in the afternoon, Lady Glover sent for Arya. In the main hall, warmed by a central hearth, Lady Glover stood with her arms crossed, conversing with a few of her knights. They bowed or nodded at Arya's approach. The lady's dark eyes flicked over the younger Stark as if appraising her anew. You've brought a handful of starving peasants who might not survive the winter. Good. We'll do what we can. But we must also discover where these brigands are. If they're operating unchecked, they'll scare more innocents into the forest. Arya nodded. We'll continue searching. The men told us these bandits were seen a fortnight ago, but we have no clue where they went. One of the knights, a tall woman with her hair in a tight braid, cleared her throat. Lady Glover, if I may, I suggest we send a second patrol further east, beyond the old mill. We have a handful of riders to spare. Glover pursed her lips. We'll do that. But I must keep enough men to guard Deepwood Mott itself. The Ironborn may be gone, but we cannot be complacent. Her gaze shifted to Arya. I'd appreciate if you joined that patrol as well, Arya. You showed good sense bringing those people in. And I believe you'll have an eye for danger. Arya inclined her head. I'll go. We can set out tomorrow at dawn. Lady Glover studied her a moment. Very well. But be wary. These outlaws could be any mixture of deserters, criminals, or broken men. Some might have been in Lannister employ until they lost leadership. A realm in turmoil spawns many horrors. At the mention of Lannisters, Arya felt a subtle twinge. She forced it down. I understand. That night, she retired earlier than usual. Sleep was scarce, however. She lay awake on her narrow cot, tracing the swirling grain of the timber ceiling in the glow of her single candle. Tywin Lannister's name drifted through her thoughts. She wondered how the realm spoke of her now if the rumors had grown beyond recognition. Some might call her a hero, others a murderer, but she found it difficult to care about either label. All that mattered was that the Lions no longer had Tywin's iron will at their head, and perhaps that had saved countless northern lives. Perhaps it would spare her mother or her siblings from further anguish. Yet she knew, too, that men like Roose Bolton or Walder Frey could wreak havoc without Tywin's guiding hand. War always found a way to devour honor. In her half-sleep, she dreamt of Harrenhal once more, the labyrinth of blackened stone, the weight of Tywin's presence in those echoing halls. She recalled how his voice had dripped with casual menace, how he had studied her face and found only a servant girl. It had felt like staring into the eyes of a lion, never thinking it would be her blade that ended him. The dream twisted into a swirl of blood and crows until she startled awake, gasping for air. Sweat dampened her hairline despite the chill. She pressed a hand to her racing heart, willing it to calm. Outside, the wind howled. Before dawn, she rose and donned her gear, boots, woolens, cloak, sword belted at her waist. She munched on a heel of bread from the previous night's rations and ventured into the courtyard. The second patrol was already gathering 8 riders total this time, including Bulwer again. The tall knight with the braided hair introduced herself as Marianne Ruttiger, vassal knight to Lady Glover. She gave Arya a curt nod, her gray eyes cool but not unfriendly. Ready to hunt outlaws? Arya mounted her mare. More than ready. They set forth while the sky was still a pale steel blue, scattered clouds drifting overhead. The path bent eastward past the old mill, continuing deeper into the wood. The snow thinned in some places, revealing muddy ground, while in others it piled high, making progress slow. They pressed on for hours, halting occasionally to let the horses rest. Tracks were hard to read on such mixed terrain, but Marianne and Bulwer both had keen eyes for detail, scanning for broken branches or footprints in soft ground. Near midday, they found evidence of a recent camp, the remains of a small fire pit, footprints, and scraps of cloth. Lying in the frozen mud was a single Lannister sigil patch torn from a surcoat. Arya's heart clenched upon seeing the golden lion on red. It was battered and caked with earth, but still recognizable. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. Could these outlaws be former Lannister soldiers who had deserted after Tywin's death? Possibly. Marion spat. If the rumors are true, these might be stranded lion cubs left masterless. That could make them dangerous. Soldiers without a commander often turn to brigandage. Arya nodded, a grim set to her jaw. Then we put an end to them. They followed the tracks another mile, deeper into a thick patch of evergreen trees. The hush of winter enveloped them. A faint tang of pine filled the air, mingled with the cold dryness. The footprints eventually led to a rocky ridge that sloped down toward a winding creek. The riders dismounted, guiding their horses on foot to avoid making too much noise. Arya's heart beat faster, her senses sharpened. She felt that old mixture of fear and anticipation. Beneath the cover of the pines, they crept forward. Arya spotted a thin plume of smoke rising beyond the ridge. Marianne motioned for the group to fan out. Arya and Bulwer took the right flank, creeping over exposed roots and frozen moss. When they peered down, they saw a rough campsite near the creek, a half-circle of tents, some battered wooden crates, and about a dozen figures moving about. Metal glinted in the weak sunlight. A few carried swords. At least one wore the tattered remains of Lannister garb. Bulwer exhaled softly. That's more than just a few outlaws. They might be well armed. One of the outlaws was a burly man with a bearded face that might have once been shaved in Lannister style. Arya tried to read his posture. He moved like a soldier, not a starving peasant. Another man carried a crossbow over his shoulder, scanning the trees warily. Marianne and 3 soldiers approached from the opposite side, while Bulwer signaled the rest to be ready. The plan, it seemed, was to encircle the campsite and call for the outlaws to surrender. Yet a surrender was hardly guaranteed. Arya tightened her grip on her sword hilt. If this turned into a fight, she wanted to move quickly. She felt the memory of Farrell in her mind, swift as a deer, quiet as a shadow. Suddenly, one of the outlaws caught sight of movement among the pines. He shouted in alarm. In an instant, the man with the crossbow whirled and fired a bolt that thumped into a pine trunk mere inches from Bulwer's face. Bulwer cursed, ducking. The outlaws scrambled for weapons, a handful of them shouting curses about damned wolf lovers. That was enough for Arya to realize these were indeed men who had once served House Lannister or their allies. No time remained for talk. Marianne emerged with her sword raised, calling for them to yield. The crossbowman fired again, nearly striking one of the other soldiers. Another outlaw hurled a spear. Chaos erupted as Glover soldiers charged forward, trusting in their armor to weather the initial volley. Arya found her body moving on instinct, racing downhill through the pine needles. She heard the snap of a bowstring. An arrow hissed past her. Then she was in the midst of it, sword drawn. A wild-eyed man with a rusty axe swung at her. She sidestepped, letting the blow slice the air. Quick as a water dancer, she darted in, cutting a slash across his arm. He howled, dropping the axe. She kicked it away, pivoting toward the next threat. Another man lunged, brandishing a short sword. Arya ducked low and thrust at his unguarded thigh. He stumbled with a cry, collapsing. She felt that old tremor in her limbs but clung to clarity. This was the dance of death, and she remembered its steps. Nearby, Bulwer bashed a brigand with his shield, sending him reeling into the creek. Marianne was locked in combat with the bearded leader, whose battered shield bore faint traces of the Lannister lion. They traded fierce blows. The man was strong, but Marianne was unrelenting, pressing him back step by step. The crossbowman reloaded frantically, only for one of the Glover archers to sink an arrow into his shoulder. He screamed, dropping the weapon. Arya found herself facing another opponent, a tall youth whose face was streaked with dirt and fear. He wore the remnants of a Lannister tabard. He hesitated, sword wavering. In that instant, Arya saw not a hardened killer, but a boy who might have been forced into war. Still, he lunged. She parried awkwardly, steel ringing on steel. He overbalanced. She kicked his shin. He fell hard, weapon clattering. Yield! Arya shouted, bracing her blade at his throat. The boy's eyes were wide, and he froze, panting. She saw the same fear she once had in her own reflection, a terror of death. She pressed the sword lightly against his collar. "Yield," she repeated. He let out a choked sob. "I yield. Please. I don't want to die." She wasn't sure if she believed his sincerity, but she could see that the fight was nearly over anyway. The outlaws lay scattered, wounded or dead. Only the bearded leader still resisted, locked in a vicious exchange with Marianne. One soldier rushed to aid her, but she waved him back, determined to finish the man herself. The brigand roared, launching a savage overhead strike that Marianne sidestepped. She brought her blade up under his guard, piercing his mail. He staggered, gasping, then sank to his knees. His shield slipped from his grip, revealing a jagged tear in the lion emblem. Marianne wrenched her sword free, eyes burning with cold purpose. The man collapsed, blood pooling among the pine needles. In the sudden hush, only the groans of the wounded broke the silence. Arya kept her blade at the boy's throat, uncertain. Marianne approached, drawing heavy breaths. She eyed the youth with no sympathy. "Are you the last who can stand?" "Yes," he whimpered. "I swear, I'm done. I'll lay down arms. I had no wish to kill for no reason. I'm just trying to survive." Arya could sense Marianne's readiness to run him through if he made one wrong move. The men around them took stock of the outlaws, some still clinging to life. Bulwer knelt by one, pressing a bandage to a bleeding wound. "We might save one or two for questioning," he said. Marianne flicked her gaze to Arya. "You subdued him. Do you trust him to surrender?" Arya considered. The boy's sword lay out of reach and tears glistened on his cheeks. She had faced men who pleaded only to strike when her guard lowered. But something about this one seemed genuine. War had probably swept him along, turned him into a lost cause. "He's seen enough. If we bind his wrists, he won't trouble us." Marianne nodded. "So be it. You," she snapped at one of the soldiers, "tie him up. We'll take him back to Deepwood. The rest, see if any live who might talk. Strip them of weapons. We'll burn their dead so they don't attract wolves." The clearing became a flurry of activity. Arya stepped away, letting a soldier bind the boy's hands. She wiped her blade on the snowy ground, feeling the rush of battle ebb. Her heart still pounded. She had wounded men here, but she had not killed them outright unless it was needed. A part of her was relieved. Killing Tywin had been a singular moment of vengeance. Now each new fight felt more like brutal necessity. Marianne approached with measured steps. "You acquitted yourself well. Quick sword work. You've a knack." Arya shrugged, feeling equal parts pride and sorrow. "I learned from men who knew how to survive." The knight studied her, then placed a gauntlet hand on Arya's shoulder. "It's a pity any child must learn the sword in such times, but I'm glad you're with us. Let's gather what supplies these brigands had. That might help feed the refugees." They ransacked the camp, finding a few crates of dried beans, a small cask of ale, and some stolen clothes. Most of it was meager, but every morsel helped. Two of the outlaws were barely alive, bleeding in the snow. The Glover soldiers hurried to bind their wounds enough so they wouldn't die on the spot. Prisoners, after all, could be questioned. The snow fell softly overhead, dusting the bodies of the dead. Arya watched as a soldier methodically stripped them of valuables. She thought back to Harrenhal, to the pitilessness she had seen in men like Gregor Clegane. Was she any different now, rummaging through the spoils of war? But these men had turned brigand, taking from the defenseless. War corrupted everything. They started back under leaden skies. With the extra supplies, the wounded outlaws, and the frightened captive boy, their progress was slow. By the time they reached Deepwood again, the daylight was waning. Guards hurried out to help, hauling the crates inside, escorting the prisoners to a secure storeroom. A few men hoisted the gravely wounded on makeshift stretchers, rushing them off to the modest infirmary. Lady Glover emerged in the yard, cloak drawn tight against the chill, demanding a report. Marianne spoke first. "A group of about a dozen. Most are dead. We took 3 alive. Former Lannister men, from what we can tell." Arya offered the tattered lion patch as confirmation. Lady Glover's expression hardened. "Even here in the far north, these damnable lions haunt us. At least you put an end to their predations." She surveyed Arya. "Are you unhurt?" Arya nodded. "A few bruises, nothing more." Glover's sigh was a quiet relief. "Good. You've done what I asked. Deepwood owes you gratitude. And we owe these captives a chance to speak. I'll want to know if more of them are out there." Bulwer cleared his throat. "My lady, if I may, there were no signs of others and the footprints suggest only that group. But we can keep watch in case any stragglers remain." She agreed and dismissed them to rest. Arya felt the weight of exhaustion press on her limbs as she trudged toward her chamber. Battle's adrenaline had drained away, leaving only fatigue and the raw awareness that she had come one step closer to a world where the lines between friend and foe were seldom clear. Lannister men, now living as cutthroats in the north, had they truly once believed in Tywin's cause, or had they simply followed orders as thousands of others did until those orders crumbled? That evening, she forced herself to eat a hearty stew in the common hall, ignoring the stares and hushed comments around her. She sensed a shift in how the soldiers saw her, no longer only the rumored Stark girl who slew Tywin, but a proven fighter on the battlefield. She was not sure whether she welcomed that change or feared it. Perhaps both. Before turning in, she took a walk around the keep's perimeter. The sentries stationed on the walls saluted her. Torchlight flickered, casting dancing shadows over the timber walkway. She stared out into the dark forest, imagining how many more scattered bands of men wandered the realm without purpose. The War of the Five Kings had unleashed chaos that might not be contained merely by Tywin's death. There would be more battles, more blood, until a new order imposed itself, if it ever did. She paused at a corner of the rampart, gazing east. Winterfell lay in that direction, though a great distance away. She tried to picture it as it had been, with warm halls and laughter echoing from the great stone walls. If Theon and his Ironborn still squatted there, how changed would it be? She remembered the burnt remains of letters that had come from the north, each uncertain rumor proclaiming that Bran and Rickon were fled, or dead, or hidden. Her mother had not confirmed anything definitive. And now, separated from both parents and siblings, Arya felt that old ache of loneliness. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the cold wind sting her cheeks. In the quiet, she whispered a brief prayer to the old gods, something she had not done in a long while. She prayed for the safety of her family, wherever they were. She prayed that Winterfell might be reclaimed. And she prayed that her own heart would not grow so hardened that she forgot the innocence she once had. The wind offered no answer but a low moan, as if grieving alongside her. Days slid into a rhythm. Lady Glover questioned the captured outlaws, gleaning little aside from the fact that they had deserted after word of Tywin's death reached their commanders. Morale had collapsed in some Lannister camps, leading small groups of soldiers to scatter. They had drifted north, believing the area more lightly defended, only to find that the war's claws reached even here. Still, that knowledge was enough for Glover to double patrols, determined to keep her lands free of further lion strays. Meanwhile, Arya found herself assisting in other tasks. She pitched in with the storehouse inventory, ensuring the refugees were fed but not given so much that the garrison's own supplies would run short. She practiced with the Glover men, sparring until her muscles burned. She even joined Marianne and Bulwer in training some of the younger soldiers in quick footwork, reminiscent of the lessons Arya had once received from Syrio Farrell. Word of her skill spread. Some came to watch, curious to see the wolf girl dance with a blade. She tried to ignore their fascination, focusing only on the beats of combat. The shift of balance, the sweep of steel, the stance that might save her life one day. Amid these chores, her mind turned to Winterfell often. She pestered Lady Glover for updates on any new ravens from King Robb or Lady Catelyn, but the news was sparse and slow. Glover's maester had scant contact beyond the immediate region, as King Robb's campaigns now centered on the western lands near the Golden Tooth and beyond. Occasionally, a raven arrived from the Twins or Riverrun, bringing tidings that House Frye remained nominally loyal, that the Boltons and Karstarks were biding their time, that some lesser lords once sworn to the Lannisters had bent the knee to Robb in hopes of preserving their lands. It all signaled the slow turning of the war's tide in favor of the North. Yet no mention of direct plans for Winterfell came. Arya ground her teeth in frustration. She wondered if her mother and brother had forgotten how critical it was to retake their ancestral seat. In truth, she suspected that they had not forgotten, but that the war's complexities demanded they secure the Riverlands and the West first, cutting off Lannister resources. Then, perhaps, they would sweep north to drive out the Ironborn. Yet each day that passed was another day Theon Greyjoy had to fortify or to do harm to her little brothers, if they were even still alive. That thought gnawed at her like a starved wolf. Finally, as the new moon approached, a fresh raven arrived from the Twins. Lady Glover summoned Arya to her solar. The room was modest, dominated by a table bearing scattered maps of the northwestern coast. Glover's tone was guarded. "I've just received word from your mother," she began. Though the letter is brief and somewhat cryptic, she writes that events at the Twins require her attention and that she remains hopeful for a swift campaign to retake the West. She also says she longs to be reunited with her daughter but cannot yet send for you. Arya's heart sank. "So I'm to remain here then?" "Not necessarily," Lady Glover said, folding her hands. "A portion of the letter was directed at me as well. Lady Catelyn has requested that we prepare to move in concert with any northern lords who might act against the Ironborn. She wants our readiness, in case a swift strike on Winterfell becomes possible." Arya's eyes narrowed with mounting hope. "So we might ride on Winterfell at last? If the opportunity arises." Glover sounded more cautious than triumphant. She believes King Robb will focus on cornering the last pockets of Lannister strength in the West, but as soon as that is accomplished, or perhaps even sooner, if the Tyrells withdraw from King's Landing, forcing the Lannisters to scramble, he may turn north. The letter suggests that you might prove an asset if you are close enough to rally more houses to your banner, should the time come. Arya glanced at the map spread on the table. It showed Deepwood Motte, Torrens Square, the Bar Rowlands, and the distant shape of Winterfell. "I can rally them," she said, "but I need to go there in person. Many houses might not even believe I'm alive unless they see me with their own eyes." Glover gestured at the map. "I've considered that. Let's think on feasible paths. Torrens Square belongs to House Tallheart, loyal to the Starks, though they suffered under the Ironborn. If you journeyed there, you might find a base of support. Alternatively, the Dreadfort is under Roose Bolton, but I hesitate to send you into his care unless it's absolutely necessary." Her lip curled subtly, revealing her mistrust of the Boltons. Arya felt an answering distaste. She remembered Roose Bolton at Harrenhal. Quiet, unnerving, quick to flay. He was no friend to trust. "I'd rather not go to the Dreadfort," she said bluntly. "What of House Serwyn or House Mormont?" "Bear Island is near, but that might be a difficult route." "House Mormont is indeed near, across the bay," Glover said. "They're fierce warriors, and if you stand before Lady Meage or her daughters with your name, they might raise a significant force. However, the crossing to Bear Island is treacherous, especially in these unsettled times. The Ironborn once prowled the sea. I'm not entirely sure if it's safe." Arya paced around the table, arms folded. "But if the Mormonts join us, that would be a boon. They're as loyal to the Starks as any house could be, and we could coordinate with them to strike at Winterfell." "True," Glover allowed, "and no doubt they'd leap at the chance to help rid us of the Ironborn once and for all. But you'd need a small, capable crew to sail across. That alone is a risk. And suppose you do muster the Mormonts, how do you proceed from there? Attack Winterfell alone? That would be suicide. You'd have to wait for more banners from Tallheart or Serwyn. It's a puzzle." Arya stared at the map, jaw set. "I'll not stand idle while Theon clings to my home." Glover's voice softened. "I understand, truly. The letter from your mother suggests we must remain prepared, not rush blindly. Even so, you are her daughter, and in a sense, you are free to choose your own path. My counsel is caution. But if you decide to travel, I will spare an escort of my best men." A tremor of gratitude wove through Arya's frustration. At least Lady Glover believed in her. "Let me think on it. I want to do something that matters, not just wait for more letters to arrive." Glover nodded. "Take a day or two. Speak with your trusted companions among my soldiers if you like. Then decide. Whatever you choose, I'll lend what help I can." Arya thanked her and left the Solar, her mind brimming with possibilities. Torrens Square or Bear Island? Or simply remain in Deepwood Motte until the war swept north? She could not deny the appeal of forging an alliance with House Mormont, known for their fearless women warriors. She recalled rumors that Lady Meage Mormont's daughters were formidable in their own right. If they accepted Arya as a true Stark, that alone could tip the balance of the northern lords. But first she needed a boat, a small crew, and enough skill at sea to avoid Ironborn reavers if any still prowled the waters. She sought out Marianne that evening in the armory where the knight was oiling her blade. The flicker of torchlight cast shadows on the stone walls. Marianne nodded in greeting but continued her task with measured strokes, gliding a cloth over the steel. "Something on your mind?" she asked without turning. Arya leaned against a workbench littered with bits of chain mail. "Lady Glover wants me to decide where I'll go. We might attempt to contact House Mormont on Bear Island, or we might ride to Torrens Square. I'm no strategist, but I wonder which route is wiser." Marianne paused, glancing sideways at Arya. Both have merit. Torrhen Square is on the way toward Winterfell. The Tall Hearts are strong, but they've suffered from Ironborn attacks. Bear Island is off to the northwest, but the Mormonts are fearsome and loyal to your house. Perhaps the question is which group is more likely to rally quickly and help you strike. Arya chewed her lip. The Mormonts might be smaller in number, but they might also be more resolute. And if the seas are free of Ironborn, it could be easier to approach Winterfell from that direction, by crossing from the island's eastern shore onto the mainland. We could attempt to coordinate with Tallheart or Cerwyn from the west. Then again, if the seas aren't safe, we'd be stuck. And I'm no sailor, Marianne grunted. Nor am I. Still, Lady Glover might spare a man or two who knows the waves. We have fishermen here, though not many seafaring types. Do you feel ready to command an operation like that? Arya exhaled. No, but I can't let fear stop me. She looked at Marianne. If you were me, which path would you choose? The knight shrugged, setting aside her oiled cloth. I'm more comfortable with land routes, but that's my limitation. You might find Bear Island the surer path to strong allies. The Mormonts will not betray a Stark. I can't say the same for every other house, especially with the realm in chaos. All it would take is one cunning offer from the Lannisters or the Boltons, and lesser houses might waver. The Mormonts, though, they're like the Glovers in that loyalty is in their blood. If you show them your face, they'll bend the knee and sharpen their axes. Arya nodded slowly. That's what I suspect too. Thank you. Marianne resumed her task, dipping the cloth in oil again. Whatever you choose, I'd fight at your side if Lady Glover permits me. I know you're strong, but you'll need good steel with you. And this cause, retaking Winterfell, feels like the right blow to strike. For the north. Touched by the offer, Arya placed a hand on Marianne's shoulder. I'd be glad of your sword. I'll speak to Lady Glover. See what she'll allow. That same night, as the torches burned low in the corridors of Deepwood Motte, Arya slept fitfully, churning through the possibilities. She imagined traveling by sea, braving the waves and the unknown. She pictured forging an alliance with the Mormonts, leading them to strike at Theon's hold on Winterfell. She thought of her mother's face, the worry lines etched deeper with every passing day. She remembered her father's voice, urging caution but never cowardice. When the gray light of dawn touched the window, Arya rose from bed with her decision formed. She would go to Bear Island. When she informed Lady Glover at the morning meal, the older woman narrowed her eyes as if testing Arya's resolve. Are you certain? The sea route is far from guaranteed safe. You could lose your life before you ever see Bear Island's shores. Arya's voice was firm. I can't remain in these walls waiting for the war to come to me. The Mormonts are fierce, and if they rally, that might inspire others to join the cause more quickly. I'd rather face those risks than let Winterfell languish in enemy hands. Lady Glover nodded once, resolute. So be it. I'll arrange for a fishing vessel. We have only a few small ships here, but one is stout enough to handle coastal waters, and the man who captains her has delivered cargo up and down the shore before. He's no warrior, but he won't balk at the journey if I pay him well and impress upon him that it's for House Stark. Relief filled Arya. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. I'll also give you an escort. You can choose who among my knights or soldiers you wish to bring. Keep it small. If you land on Bear Island with a large force, they might think you come as raiders. Best to appear with a handful of loyal swords. The Mormonts will do the rest if they trust you. Arya agreed. Over the next days, she and Lady Glover made preparations. Marianne volunteered at once. Bulwer also offered, though he admitted seasickness might be an issue. A couple more seasoned soldiers, Edric and Wallace, joined them as well. Each was tested in the war's horrors. Glover provided them with traveling cloaks of warm wool, some extra dried rations, and a sealed letter attesting that Arya was indeed a Stark traveling under her protection. On a crisp morning, as a pale sun rose over the pine forests, the group made their farewells in Deepwood Motte's courtyard. Lady Glover clasped Arya's hand, her expression both stern and maternal in its concern. Be swift and be safe. I'll watch for ravens from Bear Island. When you're ready to move on Winterfell, let me know. I'll muster as many men as I can. Arya inclined her head. I will. You've done much for me. I won't forget. They mounted horses and rode westward toward the coastline where the small fishing village that harbored Glover's vessel lay. The air smelled of salt and pine as they passed the edge of the forest, emerging onto rocky shores battered by waves. The ocean stretched before them, dark and cold. A scattering of boats bobbed near a crooked wooden pier. Waiting for them was a gray-bearded man in rough spun named Hoy. He wore a battered cloak, hands calloused by years of handling nets and rigging. He eyed Arya with open curiosity. "So you're the young wolf lady come to sail to Bear Island?" Arya straightened. "I am Arya Stark, yes." He spat into the surf. "Never thought I'd see a Stark of Winterfell round these parts again. But I'll take you across if the waters hold calm. My boat's small, so no complaining about cramped quarters. And if we meet Ironborn, we may have to rely on your swords, for I carry no warship's weapons." Marion spoke up. "We'll handle any threat that rears its head." Hoy nodded, then waved them along. "Let's not waste daylight. Tide's turning in our favor." The vessel was named the Copper Jenny, though Arya saw little copper about her. She was a stout fishing boat with a single mast and a meager deck. Below was a cramped hold for nets and barrels, which Hoy had cleared somewhat for passengers. The group climbed aboard, securing their horses behind in a corral that a pair of stable hands had constructed on a raft-like barge that could be towed. It was far from ideal, but if they reached Bear Island's calmer inlets, they might be able to disembark the horses. Arya patted her mare nervously, hoping the creature would not panic at sea. Sail hoisted, they set off at the tide. The boat rocked beneath Arya's feet, prompting her stomach to lurch. She had rarely traveled by water, especially not the open sea, and each swell made her heart pound. Yet she kept her expression steeled, refusing to appear timid. Marianne offered a reassuring nod, likewise controlling her balance with some effort. Hoy barked commands to a younger deckhand, adjusting ropes and rigging. The wind carried them along the coast, the gulls crying overhead. Land soon became a hazy line of pine trees. The biting wind stung Arya's cheeks red. She clutched the railing, eyes scanning the waves for any sign of sails that might signal Ironborn. Occasionally, a wave splashed over the side, soaking her boots. The hours dragged, the unsteady motion making conversation sparse. She found her gaze locked on the horizon, where dark clouds threatened. The day wore on into a slate-gray afternoon. Hoy assured them that if the weather held, they could reach Bear Island by nightfall or soon after. The boat pressed north, following the shape of the coastline. Arya tried not to think too much about what awaited them. She needed to keep her mind focused on each moment. One misstep on the slick deck could send her tumbling. Yet her thoughts constantly drifted to the Mormonts. Would they welcome her with open arms, or would they demand proof she was truly Arya Stark? The realm was rife with impostors and trickery. She had no illusions that her mere word would suffice, but hopefully Lady Glover's letter and her own knowledge of the North's lore might convince them. Clouds thickened, the wind whipped colder, and the sun sank behind a steel-colored horizon. Darkness loomed when Hoy pointed a weathered finger at a distant mass of land rising from the sea, a jagged shore of rocky beaches, crowned with dense forest. "Bear Island," he announced, though to Arya's eyes it looked forbidding, almost as though it bristled in challenge. They drew closer, the waves surging around them. The horses whinnied in distress on the towed barge, forcing Edric and Wallace to go calm them. Arya's stomach turned as the boat pitched. She gripped the rail, breathing through her nose to quell nausea. At last, under the dim light of a cloud-veiled moon, they approached a sheltered inlet. Bear Island's coastline was jagged, but Hoy knew a path through the rocky outcroppings. A few torches glimmered on a wooden pier where silhouettes moved. Arya's heart quickened. These must be Mormont guards. She hoped they wouldn't loose arrows on them before they could explain who they were. Hoy yelled a greeting over the roar of the surf, and Marianne raised a lantern, calling, "We come under House Stark's banner. Let us speak to your lady." A moment later, they heard a voice hail them, "Come slowly and show no threat." The watchers on the pier brandished spears, their shapes barely discernible in the gloom. Hoy maneuvered the boat alongside the dock with remarkable skill. Ropes were tossed, creaking as the vessel was made fast. Arya's legs wobbled on the heaving deck, but she steeled herself. Marianne lowered the gangplank, stepping onto the slickwood, sword at her hip. Arya followed, ignoring her stiff limbs. This was it, her first step onto Bear Island. Several islanders stood at the ready, men and women alike, cloaked in furs. Their spears gleamed in the torchlight. One woman, broad-shouldered with a scar across her cheek, stepped forward. "You say you come under House Stark. Prove it." Marianne gestured to Arya. "This is Arya Stark of Winterfell, daughter of Lord Eddard Stark. She seeks audience with Lady Meege or her kin." A murmur ran through the group. The woman's gaze flicked to Arya, skepticism etched in her scowl. Arya Stark was said to be missing or dead. "Show me your face." Arya drew back her hood, meeting the woman's eyes with a steeled gaze. I am Arya, daughter of Eddard, sister to Robb, who is king in the north. I have come to beg Lady Mormont's help in reclaiming Winterfell from the Ironborn. The woman stared for a long moment. Another behind her whispered, could it be? The rumors said she killed Tywin Lannister. That hush spread as though they were in the presence of a living myth. At length, the scarred woman lowered her spear. I am Harma Mormont, cousin to Lady Meech. If you truly are Arya Stark, you're welcome here. But we'll have questions. It's not every day a child arrives by boat claiming a name that half the realm believes lost. Arya's jaw tightened. Ask what you will. I can answer. A beat of silence, then Harma nodded brusquely. Very well. Tie your boat secure and bring up your supplies. We'll lead you to Mormont Keep, though it's a journey of some miles on foot. We have lodging near the cove for the night if you're not up for the walk. Arya glanced at Marianne and the others. The horses would be a challenge, but the men could lead them carefully onto the dock. The hour was late, and traveling in darkness through unknown forest might be unwise. We'll shelter here tonight, Arya decided. Then come dawn, we'll meet Lady Meech. Harma seemed satisfied. She ordered a few of her people to help guide the horses off the barge. The animals came grudgingly, unnerved by the swaying planks. The islanders were patient, though, and soon the group was all ashore, water dripping from every rope. Hoy-eyed Arya. I've done my part, wolf girl. I'll stay here with the boat till you decide you need me again or not. Arya thanked him quietly, slipping him a small purse of coins from Lady Glover's supply. He nodded without any flourish, evidently content that he had done a job well enough. The islanders led the newcomers toward a cluster of huts near the treeline. Torchlight revealed a rough palisade and watchtower from which a few more Mormont archers peered down warily. Inside, they found a simple courtyard ringed by wooden shacks used by fishermen and scouts. Harma pointed out a vacant hut with a thatched roof. You can bed down here. We'll stand guard in case any Ironborn try to land on another part of the shore. This island never sleeps easy. Marianne set her pack down, scanning the area. We appreciate your hospitality. Harma's scowl softened by a fraction. We don't get many visitors, and I'll be honest, we seldom trust outsiders. But if you're truly Starks, we'll do right by you. Lady Meech will decide the rest. With that, she left them to settle in. The hut offered little comfort, bare walls, a dirt floor, a lingering fishy odor from old nets. Still, Arya was grateful to be off the boat. The group lit a small lantern, ate some dried rations, and arranged their bedrolls along the edges. Outside, the wind rattled the hut's crude shutters. Marianne shot Arya a faint smile. You've done it. We're here. Arya nodded, a surge of nervous excitement fluttering in her belly. This is only the beginning. She lay down on her rolled cloak, eyes staring at the thatched roof, listening to the distant hush of waves crashing on the shore. Each step forward brought her closer to that final confrontation. Winterfell, Theon, her family's scattered members. She had survived Harrenhal and parted from her mother. She had navigated Deepwood Motte, fought brigands in the pine forests, and endured a sea crossing. Now she stood on the threshold of House Mormont's domain, hoping to kindle their ancient bond with House Stark. It all felt surreal, as though she walked a path laid out by old gods she barely remembered. Night passed in a haze of dreams. She saw herself in the godswood at Winterfell, the weirwood's red leaves whispering, father's face in the bark. Then the image shifted to Tywin's eyes, cold in death. A swirl of crow feathers and blood, and she was bounding through the forest as a wolf, tasting snow on her tongue. When she woke at dawn, she blinked away the dream's afterimages, feeling more tired than rested. Yet she rose, steeling herself for the new day. Harma arrived with 2 other islanders at dawn's first light, bringing them coarse bread and a pot of fish stew. Arya forced the food down, ignoring the faint queasiness the fish odor stirred in her belly. She was too determined to be squeamish. The group saddled their horses. Fortunately, the beasts seemed relieved to be back on solid ground and followed Harma along a narrow trail into the depths of Bear Island's forest. The trees here were dark conifers, towering overhead like silent guardians. Needles carpeted the path, muffling the sound of hooves. Occasionally, they glimpsed watery sunlight through the canopy. The air felt chill and damp. Harma explained that Mormont Keep lay in the island's interior, somewhat central, so that watchers could defend any shore that might be assailed by raiders. The path wound through low hills, across a frigid stream, and past scattered huts of fisherfolk who eyed Arya's party warily from their doorways. Everywhere, Arya sensed the atmosphere of a people always poised to fight. It reminded her of the stories of the Mormont women who could swing axes as well as any man. They had to, living so near the ocean, threatened by Ironborn for generations. After a few hours of travel, they crested a ridge to find a stout wooden fortress nestled against a rocky rise. Mormont Keep was smaller than Winterfell but exuded a rugged strength. The walls were timber, reinforced with earthen ramparts. A banner bearing the Black Bear sigil flapped from a tall watchtower, snapping in the breeze. Guards at the gate looked tense until Harma called out, "It's me, and we've brought visitors for the lady." The gates opened onto a courtyard of packed earth, scattered with training posts and a few sheds. Islanders passed by with baskets of fish or wood, their expressions turning curious as they beheld the strangers. Harma dismounted. Arya and her companions followed suit, leading their horses forward. A tall woman in a cloak of bear fur emerged from the main hall, flanked by two daughters who looked as stalwart as she. Arya recognized Lady Midge Mormont from descriptions she had once overheard, a fierce warrior of a woman, broad-shouldered, with hair braided back in a single plait streaked by silver. Her eyes were as sharp as daggers. Harma bowed slightly. "My lady, I present Arya Stark, daughter of Eddard Stark. She says she's come seeking your help." Midge's gaze flicked over Arya, and for a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then, in a low voice, Lady Mormont said, "I'd heard rumor that Arya Stark was lost or dead, or perhaps made a thrall. Now here you stand at my gates, bold as a bear. Is it truly you?" Arya stepped forward, chin raised. "I am. I've come to ask your support in freeing Winterfell from the Ironborn. House Stark has always trusted the Mormonts, and we hope that trust endures." Midge's lips curved in something like a smile, though it was tinged with sternness. "We do not forget our oaths, child. The Mormonts remember, even when the rest of the realm might have lost its mind with all these kings warring. But I must be certain of who stands before me." She raised a hand, and her two daughters stepped aside, letting her approach. Closer up, Arya could see the lines of battle scars on her forearms. Midge smelled faintly of the smoke from hearth fires. She eyed Arya's features, as though measuring her life story in a glance. Then she asked a series of questions, some about Arya's time at Winterfell, details only a true Stark might recall. She inquired about which of Arya's siblings teased her the most, which tower she once climbed on a dare, which caretaker used to scold them for muddy boots. Arya answered truthfully, feeling tears prick her eyes as she remembered. Old Nan's stories, the broken tower, the time she loosed a flock of ravens by accident. The woman's expression softened with each response. "Ah, child," Midge said quietly, laying a broad hand on Arya's shoulder. "You are a Stark, no doubt of that. Forgive my caution. These are treacherous times." Arya swallowed. "I understand. I've seen more treachery than I care to remember." Midge stepped back, her voice carrying in the courtyard. "Then let all Bear Island bear witness. Arya Stark stands among us. We stand with her in the name of House Stark." A murmur of approval rippled among the gathered islanders. Some even grinned, excitement lighting their faces. Midge turned to Arya again, brow furrowing. "But you come not for ceremony. You come to ask my help in reclaiming your ancestral seat." Arya nodded firmly. "Winterfell remains under the Ironborn, led by Theon Greyjoy, who betrayed us. The war in the south rages on, but I can't abide letting Theon dig in any deeper. I want to rally the north to strike him down and free Winterfell." Midge's daughters exchanged glances. One, tall and rangy, with a face so reminiscent of her mother, stepped forward. "We'd relish any chance to drive the Ironborn out. They've raided our shores for generations." "I'm Daisy Mormont." Arya recalled the name, a Mormont woman known to ride with Robb Stark at one point. She offered a small smile. "I've heard of you. My brother valued your counsel." Daisy's eyes flickered at the mention of Robb. "He's a fine king. Or so we still believe, though word is scattered. We receive few ravens here. I served him for a time in the Riverlands before I was needed back home. If you intend to reclaim Winterfell, you'll have my spear at your side." Midge let out a satisfied grunt. "There you have it. But let's speak inside, child. Tell me exactly what you need from the Mormonts." They led Arya and her companions into the main hall, a timber structure that smelled of smoke and pine resin. The hearth in the center crackled with fresh logs, radiating a welcome warmth. Trophies of hunts and battles hung on the walls, bear claws, ironborn axes, battered shields. Arya felt a strange kinship. This was a place of hardy survivors, much like Deepwood Mott, but with an added fierceness that was uniquely Bear Island. They sat at a long table where Midge offered cups of hot broth spiced with herbs. Marianne, Bulwer, and the two other soldiers introduced themselves properly. Midge listened politely, though her gaze kept returning to Arya as if she could hardly believe a Stark was here. Once the introductions were done, Arya began outlining what she knew. She spoke of Tywin's death, of the realm's chaos, of her mother's letter urging readiness for an eventual push north. She described how Theon had seized Winterfell, rumor claiming he might only have a limited force, but it was enough to hold the castle as long as no one mounted a concerted attack. Midge rubbed her chin, eyes shrewd. Aye, that treacherous whelp Theon burned our villages, took your home. He might have a small force, but behind those walls, even a handful of Ironborn can hold off a larger army, especially if we can't muster enough men quickly. But your mother is pinned at the twins, your brothers in the west. We can't expect them to come riding to Winterfell's rescue tomorrow. Arya nodded, frustration evident in her face. That's why I want to gather whatever northern houses we can: Glover, Mormont, maybe Tall Heart or Serwyn. If we strike in unison, we might overwhelm the Ironborn before they can rally. Dacey frowned. That's still a tall order. The Tall Hearts might help, but they're worn thin from prior Ironborn raids. The Serwyns I'm less certain of. Some rumor suggests they lost men to the Lannisters. But we can try. She exchanged a look with Midge. We have perhaps 300 fighting men and women we could spare if we leave enough behind to guard Bear Island from any further raids. Midge considered, then gave a curt nod. We can raise that many. And with Glover's men, maybe we have 500 or 600. That might suffice if we catch Theon unawares. Or if the Ironborn are fewer than rumored. Arya's pulse quickened. Yes. If we strike quickly, we might do it with fewer than 1,000. Father always said Winterfell's walls are strong, but the castle is large. Theon must spread his men thin to hold all vantage points. A determined assault could break him. Midge's rough hand slapped the table. Then let's be about it. We'll begin preparations immediately. You'll have your own warband, Arya Stark. A thrill coursed through Arya's veins. She hadn't expected Lady Midge to be so direct, but that was the Mormont way. Plain, fierce, loyal. Yet a kernel of caution remained. We should coordinate with Lady Glover. She'll need to know. We parted with the promise that if we found an opportunity, we'd alert her. Dacey smiled wryly. Then we'll send a raven to Deepwood Motte. She can gather her force and march east. We'll cross the sea back to the mainland ourselves. The journey is a burden, but we do it often enough to face the Ironborn along the coasts. Midge rose from her seat. We have no time to waste. Dacey, you handle the ravens. I'll rally the men. Child, you and your companions can rest here for the night. On the morrow, you'll see how the Mormonts prepare for war. Arya stood as well, matching Midge's directness. Thank you, Lady Midge. The North won't forget this. Midge's eyes gleamed. Nor will we forget who calls us to avenge old wrongs and save our liege lord's seat. Now enough talk. Prepare yourselves. Winter is coming, and we've an iron price to extract. As the day wore on, Arya and her retinue found themselves caught in a whirlwind of Mormont activity. The yard filled with men and women testing bows, honing spears, inventorying supplies. A group of fisherfolk prepared boats to ferry the warriors. Dacey oversaw the writing of a raven message to Lady Glover, detailing the plan to meet at a certain cove on the mainland. That evening, the hall resounded with the ring of hammers on steel and the deep chanting of Bear Island's war songs. Arya watched in awe, both excited and a little anxious, as the Mormonts readied themselves with methodical ferocity. Marianne was impressed. They're well organized for an island force, she remarked, arms folded as they observed the courtyard from an upper walkway. Below them, Mormont warriors spun axes in practiced routines, while others prepared battered longships for crossing the bay. Arya nodded. My father always spoke highly of the Mormonts. They may not be the largest house, but they're among the bravest. Bulwer, standing by the railing, wore a look of cautious optimism. Let's hope that bravery is enough to wrest Winterfell from the Ironborn. If Theon sees us coming, he might burn half the castle in defiance. Arya's gut twisted. She had heard rumors that Theon had already done unspeakable things to prove his control. We'll move quickly and give him little time. House Stark's seat will not be turned to ash, not if I have anything to say about it. They parted to rest, though Arya felt sleep was scarce. She lay awake in a small chamber lent to her by Midge, the walls adorned with carved bear motifs. The faint glow of a single candle danced on the rough timbers. She tried to quell her anxiety, but each breath felt like a stoked ember. She was about to lead, or at least help lead, a real campaign to retake Winterfell. Could she do it? Could a girl who had fled King's Landing in fear, who had been forced to kill Tywin Lannister in the shadows, now stand openly as a Stark reclaiming her birthright? Yes, she told herself, pressing her eyes shut. She was not the frightened child she'd once been. She had grown amid horrors. Syrio's lessons, Yoren's sacrifice, Jaqen's cryptic guidance, the unspeakable act at Harrenhal. They had forged her into something unyielding. She pictured each face she had lost. Father, who believed in her. Sansa, trapped in King's Landing. Bran and Rickon, out of reach. Even Jon, exiled to the Wall. She felt them all with her, fueling her resolve. Winterfell must not remain in enemy hands. At dawn, the keep awoke to a flurry of final preparations. Mormont archers tested bowstrings, swords were sharpened, ships were loaded with supplies. The plan was that Daisy would lead the main body of Mormont warriors across the sea in their own longships, while Arya, Marianne, and Bulwer returned by Hoy's fishing vessel, ensuring that Glover's men and Mormonts arrived in tandem. They would disembark near Deepwood Mott's coast or a bit south, muster with the Glovers, and strike east toward Winterfell in a swift march. Meanwhile, ravens were also dispatched to Torrhen's Square, hoping the Tallhearts might add numbers. Standing on the dock, Arya watched the Mormont longships bob in the dark water. Their prows bore carved bear heads, fierce and weathered. Midge Mormont herself emerged, armor gleaming in the early sun. She clasped Arya's arm in farewell. "We'll see you on the mainland in a few days' time. When the bear and wolf unite, let the Ironborn quake." "They'll do more than quake," Arya vowed. "They'll fall." Midge grinned, then turned to board her flagship. Daisy took up position beside her mother, leading a chorus of warriors who chanted an Old Bear Island battle cry. The combined voices resonated over the waves, primal and raw. Arya felt a shiver of excitement. She moved to Hoy's boat, the Copper Jenny, joined by Marianne, Bulwer, Edric, and Wallace. Hoy greeted them with a sardonic grunt. "Guess we're part of a war fleet now. Don't blame me if the fish cringe when they see us coming." Arya smirked. "Just get us safely there. I'll handle the fish." As they set sail, the Mormont longships unfurled their sails as well, forming a rough flotilla. The crossing back to the mainland would be precarious if storms rose, but the day looked clear, with a stiff breeze that favored them. Arya stood at the prow of the fishing vessel, the wind streaming through her short hair. She felt the brine sting her cheeks, tasted salt on her lips, and let her gaze drift over the water toward the distant gray line of land. On that shore waited the next step in her journey, the forging of a northern alliance to strike at Winterfell. A hush fell over her mind for a moment, the swirl of her thoughts calming as she watched gulls wheel overhead. She recalled an early lesson from Syrio: there is only one God, and his name is death. And there is only one thing we say to death: not today. She had repeated that mantra in fear when the Lannisters took her father's head. Yet now it rang differently in her ears. She was no longer merely surviving. She was choosing to fight back, not for revenge alone, but for home, for family, for the North. The boat sliced through the waves, the Mormont longships fanning out behind in a broad line. Arya felt an almost giddy sensation in anticipation of the battles and challenges to come. She knew pain and death lay on the horizon, but she also knew that the battered remains of House Stark still held power in the hearts of the northern people. If she could help unite them, if she could tear down Theon's occupation, then Winterfell might stand tall again. Perhaps her mother and Robb would find a seat not rotted by Ironborn cruelty when they returned. Perhaps her little brothers could be saved if they lived. Perhaps the North would rally around the Stark banner, flanked by the black bears of Mormont and the mailed fists of Glover. For hours, the crossing remained steady. The wind gusted, filling the sails. Occasional shouts and jests passed between the ships, carrying a note of optimism. Arya inhaled the chill air and found it bracing, reminding her she was alive, that she was forging her destiny. She felt not the frightened child, but the wolf grown lean and cunning. By midday, the coastline neared. Hoy steered them into a familiar cove, the same from which they had departed, and the boat rocked as it found a place among the rocks. The The Mormont longships anchored further out, sending smaller craft to ferry men to shore. Arya jumped onto the damp sand, sword jostling at her hip. Marianne and Bulwer followed, scanning the vicinity. A handful of Glover soldiers were there, presumably scouts, waiting with a few pack horses. Surprised to see such a large armed force arriving, they lowered their spears, gawking at the lines of Mormont warriors coming ashore. One recognized Arya and gave a startled bow. "My lady, we weren't expecting an army." Arya brushed aside formality. "We have no time to waste. I need to speak to Lady Glover immediately. Send word that House Mormont stands ready to march on Winterfell." The scout's eyes widened, but he bowed again. "I will ride ahead. Deepwood Motte will greet you with open gates." So it was that they made their return to Lady Glover's domain, this time not as a ragtag handful but leading several hundred Mormont warriors. The land route from the cove to Deepwood Motte took hours, the setting sun casting long shadows across the pine forest. Along the way, men and women from the local hamlets peered out in awe at the dark-furred, axe-wielding Mormonts. The Mormont banners fluttered, black bears on green fields. Arya rode near the front with Daisy, who had come ashore quickly on a smaller boat, and Marianne, discussing the route they would take to Winterfell. They resolved to meet Lady Glover's forces in the clearing near the motte, then push east. If the Tall Hearts answered the call, they could join from the south. House Serwyn might muster from the east. They reached Deepwood Motte's walls under a blood-red sunset. The gates opened, revealing torchlight in the courtyard. Lady Glover stood there, flanked by her knights, her expression torn between surprise and resolve. She greeted Mage Mormont with a firm clasp of hands, and after a flurry of introductions, the two ladies retired inside to plan their next moves. Arya joined them, Marianne at her side. Together, they pored over a fresh map. Glover's eyes shone with the fierce glint of impending battle. "You move quickly, Lady Mage," she said, impressed. "I only just received your raven this morning. We have begun mustering. I can field 200 men from my lands, plus the recovered outlaws who've pledged to fight for a pardon." Torrens Square responded with a single raven, uncertain if they can spare many, but we'll see. A band of free riders from the mountains near here might also lend swords for a price. Mage nodded. "We have near 300 at the ready, plus the handful you'll add." "It might do. We'll not lay a long siege, we'll strike swiftly as Arya suggests." Arya leaned over the map, her brow furrowed. "We can travel the main road east or skirt the forest paths to approach from the north, where Winterfell's defenses might be weaker. But that forest is thick and the going slow." Lady Glover tapped the parchment with a finger. "The main road is more direct. If Theon has scouts, they'll see us coming either way. We might as well take the faster route. But we must ensure he can't slip away with hostages." Arya's face darkened. "If my brothers are inside, Theon might threaten them." She recalled the rumors that Theon had killed them, but part of her refused to believe it. "We'll need a plan to breach the walls quickly, preventing him from harming any prisoners." Mage let out a deep breath. "We can't be certain they're even alive, child. But if they are, we'll do what we must to protect them." Those words stung, but Arya nodded. "We'll proceed with all speed then. Tomorrow morning we march, gather more of your men along the way, and hopefully reach Winterfell in 2 or 3 days if the weather holds. Let Theon quake." That night, Deepwood Motte brimmed with Mormonts singing war songs, Glover men sharpening swords, the courtyard alive with braziers and campfires. Arya found she could hardly rest, the excitement coursing in her veins. She stood near one of the watchfires, gazing at the flickering flames while men around her murmured of the battle to come. She half expected her mother to stride out of the darkness and scold her for risking so much. But Lady Catelyn was far away, entangled in the duties that came with forging alliances in the Riverlands. Robb was even farther, if the rumors were true, chasing Lannister remnants in the west. Thus, it fell on Arya to lead here, to call the banners in her family's name. The knowledge both thrilled and terrified her. Marianne approached quietly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You should get at least a few hours' rest, my lady. Tomorrow will be a hard march." Arya gave a slight nod. "I will. Just needed a moment to think. It's all happening so fast." The knight's face softened. "You're shouldering a burden many grown lords would tremble beneath. But you've proven your courage before." "Tywin Lannister," she broke off, perhaps realizing the memory was too raw. "I believe in you, Arya." A ghost of a smile touched Arya's lips. "Thank you. I believe in our cause." They parted ways, and Arya found a quiet corner inside the keep to lay down her bedroll. The halls were crowded with Mormonts and Glover men exchanging stories, but she eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep. She dreamt of Winterfell rising out of the snow, Theon's face twisted in anger, ravens swirling overhead with black wings. She saw Tywin's face merge with Theon's for an instant, a monstrous reflection of the men who had wronged her family. She jolted awake, covered in cold sweat, heart pounding. Dawn came with a dull gray sky, spitting flakes of snow. Still, the warband formed up in the courtyard, banners snapping in the wind, horses stomping. Arya stood with Lady Meege and Lady Glover at the forefront. Roughly 500 men and women crowded behind them, a patchwork of Mormont furs and Glover leather, plus a smattering of others who had pledged their arms. It was not the mightiest host the North had ever seen, but it was enough, Arya hoped, to topple Theon's hold. A hush fell as Lady Glover raised her voice. "Warriors of the North, we ride to free Winterfell, seat of our liege lords. Let none doubt our resolve. The Ironborn have no place in these lands. This day we fight for the honor of House Stark." A roar rose in response. Spears thumped against shields, axes brandished high. Arya's blood sang with the sound. Then, with Meege Mormont at her side, she spurred her horse forward. The gates creaked open, and the column poured out into the pine forest. Snow flurries drifted around them, a reminder of the encroaching winter. Yet a fierce warmth glowed in Arya's chest. Here was the North united in purpose. Over fallen branches and frozen streams they marched, the thunder of hooves and boots echoing among the pines. Their breath clouded the air, and the hush of the woods pressed in. They moved steadily eastward, aiming for the King's Road that would lead them directly to Winterfell. Scouts ranged ahead, ensuring no Ironborn ambush lay in wait. The land seemed hushed, as though anticipating the storm of battle. Arya rode near the vanguard, occasionally exchanging a word with Marianne or Bulwer. The men behind them spoke of the castle's rumored defenses, of possible reinforcements Theon might have. Arya recalled every corridor of Winterfell's interior, every turret and hidden passage. She quietly advised Meege that the gate near the broken tower was less heavily fortified, or that the battlements near the old well had vantage points. She prayed that knowledge would give them an edge. By midday, the snow thickened, the cold biting deeper. The forest thinned, revealing a wide path caked in ice and muddy slush. They pressed on. In her heart, Arya felt the steady thrum of determination. She pictured Theon's face, the haunted expression she had last seen on him years ago, twisted by betrayal. She pictured her father's quiet smile, urging her to do her duty to family. The air tasted of iron, as though fate itself hovered on the edge of a blade. Near nightfall, they found a place to make camp, a sheltered hollow beneath the canopy of towering pines, close to a frozen stream. Tents were erected, fires kindled. The smell of cooking meat mingled with the sharp tang of pine sap. Arya stood by a campfire, warming her hands as Lady Meege and Lady Glover conferred on the route. They estimated 2 more days' march at least, given the icy roads. That night, many spoke in hushed tones of the looming confrontation. Some men sharpened axes or mended gear. Others prayed to the old gods, kneeling beneath the snow-laden boughs. Marianne approached Arya with a tin cup of hot broth. "Eat something. You've hardly touched your rations all day." Arya accepted the cup, taking a sip of the savory liquid. The warmth seeped through her, a welcome comfort. "Thank you," she murmured. The night settled beside her. For a time, they watched the flames dance. Then Marianne ventured, "We'll be in sight of Winterfell soon, yes?" "Soon," Arya said, voice low. "I wonder how it'll look now. Will the towers be scorched? Will the yard be empty, or full of iron cages? I have so many questions. I've heard rumors Theon forced the small folk to submit, that he might have tried to fake my brother's deaths. I can't let fear stop me, but the not knowing is torture." Marianne's hand squeezed Arya's shoulder gently. "We'll learn the truth soon enough. And whatever state the castle is in, we'll reclaim it." Arya nodded, her expression set. "The North remembers. The Ironborn will learn that soon." Sleep came again in fragments, each hour filled with the rustle of the camp. Dawn arrived gray and silent, the snow deepening. The column formed once more, pressing onward. Ice crunched underfoot. A sullen wind whistled. Despite the cold, a current of raw energy coursed through the host. Each soldier knew they approached the seat of House Stark, and whether for duty, loyalty, or vengeance, they marched with iron resolve. They reached the King's Road by midday, where they found an old inn half-burned. Glover scouts scoured it, reporting signs of old Ironborn activity but no recent presence. They pushed on. The road ran south, leading them around a bend that eventually curved toward the heart tree in Winterfell's Godwood. Arya felt her heart clench at the memory of that ancient weirwood. Perhaps soon she would stand beneath its red leaves again. That evening they saw the faint silhouette of Winterfell's tall towers on the horizon, ghostly against the twilight sky. Smoke curled from inside the walls, suggesting fires burned there. Was it Theon's men, or a sign of turmoil? The host halted at a safe distance, sheltered by a copse of trees. Lady Glover and Lady Meege summoned their captains and Arya to plan the final approach. Arya peered at the looming shape of Winterfell, her pulse racing. She recognized the outline of the first keep, the great hall's pitched roof, the ramparts along the main gate. It felt like greeting a wounded friend. The gates were closed, no banners visible in the dark. If Theon was inside, he had no reason to flaunt his standard. Meege's voice was a low growl. Nightfall is near. Attacking under cover of darkness might give us surprise, but we risk confusion. Alternatively, we can wait till dawn. But that gives Theon time to spot us and prepare. Lady Glover glanced at Arya. What do you think? Arya closed her eyes briefly, recalling the layout. Winterfell has some vantage towers. If Theon posted watchers, they might already have glimpsed our torches. But at night, we can conceal our numbers somewhat and maybe slip part of our force close to the walls before they realize the full threat. A soldier from Mormont, an older man with a bandaged ear, spoke up. Sneaking that many men unseen is near impossible, especially across open ground. But we could dispatch a small infiltration group while the main force waits. Marianne nodded. Perhaps I can lead a squad to the postern gate if the walls there are lightly guarded. Once inside, we open the main gate from within. That could save many lives. Arya's heart pounded. She remembered a postern gate near the kitchens, though Theon might have barred it. She also knew a handful of hidden nooks in the courtyard, but to cross them unseen demanded luck. Then again, she was no stranger to stealth. I'll go, she said firmly. I know the castle, the passages. If we can slip in quietly, we can open the gate. Lady Glover frowned. It's dangerous. Meege's gaze was intense. She's the best choice, though. If anyone knows Winterfell's corners, it's Arya Stark. Still, I won't force you, child. Arya set her shoulders. I want to do it. If there's a chance to spare the castle a bloody siege, I'll take it. And so, under the cloak of darkness, the plan took shape. A small group of a dozen, led by Arya, Marianne, and Bulwer, would circle the castle's perimeter, seeking the old postern gate. If it was guarded, they would neutralize the guards quietly. If it was sealed, Arya might recall how to unbar it from the inside. Once inside the yard, they would signal the main force with a torch from the battlements, then open the main gate. The rest of the army would rush in. If it went poorly, they would revert to an assault at dawn, though that might cost more lives. Night deepened, the moon a thin crescent behind drifting clouds. Winterfell loomed like a silent monolith, its walls lit only by a few torches. Arya led her infiltration party from the treeline. They crouched low, stepping carefully over the snowy ground. Her breath came in shallow bursts, each exhalation a wisp of vapor. Memories cascaded. She had run these grounds as a girl, chasing cats, climbing walls. Now she approached like a thief, prepared to kill if needed. They circled to the north side, where the old postern gate stood. The walls here were tall, but a portion near the broken tower offered partial cover. Arya peered through the gloom. She could just make out two shapes posted atop the ramparts, their torches faintly illuminating the crenellations. Ironborn? Possibly. Or thralls forced to guard. Either way, they had to be dealt with. Marianne motioned to Bulwer and another soldier to quietly climb the outer slope. It was tense work. The men used grappling hooks muffled with rags. Arya pressed herself to the cold stone, straining to see if the guards above noticed. The swirling wind helped mask their presence. Snow battered them in gusts. Eventually, there was a muted scuffle of boots. A gasp. Then silence. Bulwer peered down, gesturing that they'd handled the guards. Arya exhaled in relief. She slipped through the postern gate area. The gate itself was shut, but not heavily barred. Likely Theon's men assumed the main threat would come from the front. With some effort, Arya and Marianne managed to unhook the latch, pushing it open. One Ironborn guard sat near the foot of a small internal staircase, dozing beside a brazier of coals. He jerked awake at the rustling, but had time only for a startled grunt before Arya's blade caught him in the throat. Warm blood spattered on the stones. Arya stifled a shudder. There would be more of that before the night was done. They moved cautiously into the courtyard. Winterfell smelled of soot and old straw. Torches flickered along the inner walls. Arya's heart ached at the sight of the stables, half-burned from some past altercation. She saw battered scaffolding near the Great Hall. At least part of the castle had been scorched. Fury flared within her. Theon had wrought ruin here. They heard footsteps. Two Ironborn patrolled near the well. Marianne signaled. Arya pressed herself against a wall as the men passed. Their conversation was faint in the cold air, something about Theon's madness and damned Northmen. Before they could react, Bulwer and another soldier tackled them, muffling their cries. Steel glinted. It was over quickly. The courtyard was theirs for the moment. Arya glanced at Marianne. "We need to open the main gate now." A short dash across the yard brought them to the gatehouse's interior. Another guard dozed by a brazier, oblivious to the infiltration. Arya's group took him by surprise. He died with scarcely a whimper. They found the mechanism controlling the heavy gates, chains and gears leading to the portcullis. With a strained heave, they began turning the winch. The squeal of metal echoed too loudly. If any Ironborn still lurked nearby, they'd be alerted. Marianne cursed. "Keep turning. We'll hold them off if they come." Arya poured her strength into the effort. The gate rose inch by inch. She prayed Lady Glover and Mage Mormont were watching for the signal. Through the gate's opening, she glimpsed the darkness beyond the walls. Then she saw shapes moving, a line of torches as the northern army advanced. They must have heard the gate's chain. War horns sounded, a deep moan that reverberated across the yard. Shouts arose from the castle's inner buildings. Ironborn scrambled from side passages, some half-dressed, others clutching axes. Chaos ignited. A handful rushed the gatehouse, only to meet Marianne's sword and the spears of her men. Arya kept cranking the winch, sweat beading on her brow despite the chill. She could hear the clang of steel. Her comrades fought bravely, bottlenecking the Ironborn in the narrow passage. Then the portcullis was high enough for horses to enter. Arya abandoned the winch, drawing her blade. With a fierce cry, she joined the melee. She parried a wild swing from a man who stank of ale. Her training took over, and she slipped inside his guard, stabbing into his side. He collapsed, cursing. Another crashed at her from behind, but Marianne pulled him away, their blades ringing. From the open gate, the thunder of hooves filled the courtyard. Lady Glover led the charge, followed by Mage Mormont and her axe-wielding warriors. They poured into Winterfell like a torrent, scattering the Ironborn. The yard erupted in chaos, torchlight dancing over swirling snow. Men screamed, steel clashed on steel, and the battered stones of Winterfell groaned beneath new bloodshed. Arya's heart pounded, her breath ragged, but a deep sense of purpose anchored her. This was it, the moment to free her home. She saw Theon's men rally near the great hall, about 20 of them forming a shield wall. Lady Glover bellowed an order, and her archers let fly a volley of arrows, peppering the Ironborn. Mage Mormont led a wedge of axe fighters who smashed into the shield line. With splintered, men fell. Arya darted forward, slicing at a flailing Ironborn who tried to run. Her blade found flesh. His eyes widened, then he toppled, blood staining the snow. Amid the cacophony, Arya spotted a figure near the keep's entrance, Theon Greyjoy himself, wrapped in a fur cloak, sword in hand, face twisted in desperation. He shouted orders to a handful of men, but they seemed hesitant. Some were already dropping their weapons, seeing they were outnumbered. Theon cursed them as cowards, slashing at the air. For a heartbeat, Arya locked eyes with him across the courtyard. She felt a surge of white-hot rage. Here stood the traitor who seized her home, who might have harmed her brothers, who had left Winterfell in ruins. Without thinking, she sprinted toward him. A cluster of Ironborn moved to intercept her, but Marianne and Bulwer tackled them. Arya sidestepped a wounded man, her boots skidding on bloody snow. Theon saw her coming, recognized her. Fear flickered in his eyes. He mouthed something, her name, or maybe just a curse. Then he turned to flee into the keep, shoving aside one of his own men who tried to block his path. Arya gave chase, adrenaline fueling each step. She heard distant shouts, "Secure the courtyard, and don't let Theon escape." Theon dashed inside, disappearing down a corridor. Arya followed, ignoring the chaos behind her. Inside, the corridors of Winterfell were dimly lit by flickering torches. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the walls familiar yet twisted by memory. She glimpsed the spot where once she had hidden from Queen Cersei's men. She recalled running these halls as a child, laughing. Now her footsteps echoed with the clang of steel. She rounded a corner to find Theon at the far end, struggling with a locked door. He turned at the sound of her approach, sword raised. "You," he spat, voice hoarse. "You're supposed to be dead. The whole family." Arya advanced, blade extended. "You took Winterfell, murdered and burned. Maybe you killed my brothers. Maybe not. Either way, you're done." He sneered, though fear lined his eyes. "I did what I had to. For my father, his voice cracked. The war forced my hand. It wasn't personal." Arya trembled with fury. "It's personal to me. Drop your sword or fight." For a moment, Theon's gaze flicked from her to the corridor behind, as though seeking escape. Then, with a ragged cry, he lunged. Arya was smaller, but she darted aside, deflecting his strike. Her water-dancing training guided her feet. Theon slashed again, close enough that she felt the wind of it. She twisted away, struck back, her blade biting into his forearm. He howled, dropping his sword. She leveled the point at his throat, chest heaving. A swirl of conflicting emotions raged within her, triumph, hatred, sorrow. Theon sank to his knees, clutching his bleeding arm, eyes wild. "Kill me," then he spat, tears mixing with fury. "Kill me if that's what you want." Arya's hand shook. She remembered how she killed Tywin, the sense of finality, the blood. He had deserved it. But what of Theon? Could she show mercy after all he had done? She thought of her father's words about passing the sentence and swinging the sword. Then she thought of her mother's desire for unity. Footsteps sounded behind them. Marianne ran up, panting, sword drawn, followed by 2 Mormont soldiers. They froze, seeing Theon at Arya's mercy. Theon turned wild eyes on them. "Mercy," he gasped. "She's the real killer, you know? Arya Stark." Arya pressed the blade closer. "Stand up." His lips twisted. "You're going to drag me out there, show everyone you triumphed, yes? Maybe your mother will flay me. Or your brother. I heard the Boltons have a taste for that. Do it then." Arya's heart hammered. This moment felt heavier than any she had known since Harrenhal. "I won't let you escape justice," she said, voice tight. "But I'm not a Bolton. My father taught me a different way." She backed up a step, gesturing to the Mormont soldiers. "Bind him. We'll take him prisoner. He'll answer for his crimes to the king in the north and to my mother." Theon's face twisted in relief, shame, and scorn all at once. He did not resist as the soldiers yanked him upright, tying his arms. Arya stared at him, loathing warring with an odd pity. He looked like a broken man, a ruin of what he had once been in Winterfell's carefree days. She wondered if that carefree boy had ever truly existed or if it was all a lie from the start. They escorted him back to the courtyard where the last remnants of Iron-born resistance had collapsed. Bodies littered the snow. Lady Glover and Midge Mormont oversaw the final securing of the castle gates. A ragged cheer went up as word spread that Theon was captured. Some demanded his head on the spot. Midge had to bark them down, reminding them that Arya was the highest Stark present and would decide. Arya stood in the courtyard as Theon was thrown to the ground in front of her. Torches lit the battered stones. Her breath trembled, seeing the ruins of her home up close, scorched timbers, broken windows, as though the castle itself had been tortured. She forced her voice steady. "You tried to steal my family's seat. You may have done worse. You will answer to my brother, the king in the north. Till then, you remain our prisoner." Theon glared up at her but said nothing. Midge stepped forward, clasping Arya's arm. "Winterfell is ours again. You did it, child." Lady Glover approached, her gaze somber as she surveyed the carnage. "The fighting's over. The Ironborn have surrendered or died. Winterfell belongs to House Stark once more." A hush settled on the courtyard. The night sky above seemed both vast and close, the stars flickering. Soldiers lowered their weapons, exhausted. Arya swallowed hard, tears burning her eyes. She thought of her father, of how proud he would be to see Winterfell free again. Yet the cost was immense and the castle was scarred. Slowly she knelt, touching the blood-stained snow with her fingertips. For a moment she closed her eyes, letting the swirl of memories pass through her. Harrenhal, King's Landing, her father's death, Tywin's final breath. All of it led here, to her reclaiming the seat of House Stark from the man who had betrayed them. She felt no triumphal glee, only a quiet resolve that some measure of justice had been done. Rising, she looked around, meeting the eyes of those who had fought for her cause. Many wore expressions of respect, relief, and the dawning realization that they had taken part in something monumental, a Stark retaking her home. Arya's voice carried softly in the hush. "Let's search the castle. See if any of my brothers still live. Take stock of the damage. Tend the wounded. This is home, but it needs our care now more than ever." Midge offered a firm nod. "We'll handle it. You, child, you should catch your breath. You've more than earned it." But Arya shook her head. "I'll rest when I know the truth about Bran and Rickon." She set off at once toward the keep's interior, accompanied by a few Mormont warriors, ignoring the numbness in her limbs. She would scour every corridor until she was certain. If they lived, she would find them. If not, she pressed that thought away, refusing to let it root. Behind her, the courtyard buzzed with activity. Soldiers extinguished fires, herded frightened small folk from hidden corners, dragged Ironborn corpses aside. Theon's fate was left for later. For now, House Stark was back in Winterfell. The frigid night air seemed to sigh with the changing winds, as if the old gods themselves had borne witness to the return of the wolves. Yet even as Arya vanished into the castle, a part of her mind lingered on the uncertain future. Her mother and Robb were still far away, the war against the Lannisters not yet concluded. She herself had stained her hands with more blood than she could count. Tywin Lannister's death had paved the way for this moment, but the realm still groaned under conflict. Perhaps the retaking of Winterfell would spark new hope across the north, or perhaps more trials waited. Regardless, Arya Stark had learned that no foe was beyond reach, be they a mighty lion or a friend-turned-traitor. And so she pressed forward into the dark halls of her home, her blade drawn, ready to face whatever remained. Winterfell was theirs once more, but the echoes of war would not be silenced so easily. Even so, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Arya allowed herself to believe that the Stark words might hold a seed of rebirth. Winter was coming, but the pack had returned to its den, and the North would remember.